Evening, everyone. Welcome to Awake in the Dream Radio. Today is Tuesday, August 19th, 2014, and this is a very special broadcast of Awake in the Dream Radio. Tonight you are joining us for our Mars Roundtable, and this is a first for us to pull this together, but the timing to have these guests together in one place at one time and to share their experiences, their information, and their perspectives, all having to do with Mars, is incredibly valuable. Tonight we have with us Randy Kramer, who has, actually all the guests have been on Awake in the Dream Radio. We have Andrew Basiago, we have Laura Eisenhower, and we have Alfred Lambremont Webre. And this is the ultimate Mars discussion group, really. And what we'd like to do is I'll introduce each one separately and have them share their story and their insights, and then we'll move into the roundtable discussion. So let's start with Captain Randy Kramer. He is a U.S. Marine and a super soldier who served for 17 years on Mars, defending the Mars colonies. He was part of Project Moonshadow and was assigned to the Mars Defense Force from a covert military branch, United States Marine Corps Special Section, set up by President Eisenhower as a unit that would uphold moral ethics and hopefully keep things in check in regards to the activity of MJ-12 and some of their more unscrupulous members. His story, information, and accounts give us insight into things that other whistleblowers have been speaking about in relation to Alternative 3 and the establishment of bases on Mars. Since he has spoken out because his chain of command requested him to do so, he's not so much a whistleblower, really more of a direct representative of the USMC Special Section. He has experiences that take us into an in-depth understanding of ET races that are interacting with Earth, covert agendas that are affecting the whole of humanity, and information about off-planet military activity that has been kept deep black and that he is now sharing with us. And so it's really a pleasure to have you here with us, Captain Randy Kramer. Welcome.
Thank you for having me again, Dr. Dream. It's nice to be back.
So, Randy, go ahead and take us into your story.
Sure. Since we're all trying to cram everybody's together, I'll try and keep it as brief as possible because it gets to be a long one. Essentially because of programs in the late 60s, super soldier programs that were going around in the various sundry of agencies that were all working on them, the United States Marine Corps Special Section was displeased with the ways and means and the results of most of the super soldier programs, which really were breaking apart people's minds and bodies in order to make them completely malleable, and was essentially creating a shorter lifespan, shorter usage, less efficient kind of super soldier than one if you did it in a better way. And so the United States Marine Corps Special Section devised a program called Project Moonshadow, which was to try and essentially what we sort of in shorthand call with the grain training as opposed to against the grain training. So instead of really trying to bend someone against their natural will, it's much more of a system of trying to use the more natural incentives that a person would want to have in order to defend their people, their community, their planet, and so forth, instead of just being forced to kill anything that moves, which really, really night and day difference when you're talking about creating a human being into one or the other. So I was essentially genetically engineered from the ground up and born in 1970 and put into a training program when I was 3.5 years old that went until I was 17 years old. And then when I was 17 years old, all of these soldiers that were produced in Project Moonshadow, which was a 300-subject program, was then parceled to a larger group called Project Mannequin. Project Mannequin is this larger umbrella that absorbs many of the super soldier programs around the world and then parcels out those soldiers to various agencies and divisions and defense groups that need them, that are both planet-side, planet-wide, outside of the planet and off-world. So when I was parceled from Project Moonshadow into Project Mannequin then sends a bunch of us to Lunar Operations Command, which is on the backside of the moon, where different people were parceled out into different organizations. I, for luck of the draw or whatever, was sent to be contracted out to the MDF, which is the Mars Defense Force, which is contracted to the MCC, which is the Mars Colony Corporation, to defend the colonies and whatever mining programs and whatever else that they're doing on Mars. So from Lunar Operations Command, then we boarded a pretty large ship. I want to say, I mean, it must have carried, at least 1,000 people or something like that. And we took off from the moon, came in a little closer to Earth to get one last view, and then took off to Mars. But from what I understand, not being able to see the trip, it was really short. So the ship, I believe, was using some kind of larger wormhole creation or teleportation technology to get there. So the trip really, once we were, okay, now we're leaving to our destination, I want to say it was less than 15 minutes or something like that. So, okay, now we're here. And then we landed on Mars down at a place called Ares Prime, which is the headquarters of the Mars Colony Corporation, where it was put into a line as you go through, follow the yellow line with your file. Someone's scanning your packet as you go through and then directing you to other shuttles. And then I was taken off to a place called Forward Station Zebra, where I spent the next 17 years, 3 months, 15 days, but who's counting, as a member of Special Tactical Operations Division 098, Forward Station Zebra, Mars Defense Force. That's the short version of that. And then essentially that 17-year, 3 months, 15-day period was a lot of patrolling the area from the quadrants of the grid that we were sort of responsible for at Forward Station Zebra. And essentially most of that involved occasional altercations with one of two sentient species that were living near us, one reptoid, one insectoid. What over time became a larger conflict when draconian reptiles got involved, and it got into this crazy four-way, from where I was standing, a four-way conflict, but it could have been more than that, could have been many, many more people involved in that. And that went on for a number of years until, long story short, some truth and understanding came to understand that the draconians were really just trying to stir everybody up and get everyone hating and trying to kill one another instead of engaging in this sort of casual ground combat, which was really what we were doing up until that point, which was, it was battle and it was war and people got hurt, but it wasn't anything like what happened when the draconians got involved. It just went from, I guess if you study war, there are different types of tribal and cultural war, where war wasn't always the point to just, kill and slaughter your enemy. Sometimes it was just engage them, be tough, rah, 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 bunch, bang your sticks and your shields together and, be sort of fierce and impressive and engage physically and not necessarily slaughter your enemy. And it was more like that until the draconians got involved, and then it got really, really, really ugly. And then again, after some time, we sorted that out through some very complicated chain of events, and there was a peace agreement that was signed, and then the war ended. And but at that point, I was essentially transferred from Forward Station Zebra after an event that pretty much wiped out almost the entire division and our sister division 097, and then I was sent to flight school and got to be a pilot and promoted, and then was stationed aboard the EDF SS Nautilus, so many acronyms, for the remainder of my 20-year tour, and made the rank of captain at that point, and got to fly around as part of Project Radiant Guardian, defending the solar system kind of thing. But since we're talking about Mars, that is the sum up of my Mars experience. So a lot of people ask me questions about the colonies, and I just have to say that I know very little, next to nothing about the colonies. We were certainly a certain space between them and anything else that supposedly might be threatening to them. So our job was to really be the buffer zone from anything outside the colonies to the colonies in the particular area of quadrants that we were supposed to be protecting. So I really don't know much about that, other than I hear that they use some kind of fancy, names like Cassiopeia, Andromeda, and something like that, sort of, Roman constellation names or something like that. But I really don't know. I will say this. The air where we were at was thin, usually cold, but breathable. Not really survivable without an environment suit, so we were in, full-powered body armor environment suits pretty much all the time when we were outdoors. I think I mentioned earlier that we did get the occasional dusting of snow across the landscape where I was at, so I'm pretty sure it was far north, but I couldn't exactly tell you where without being able to find it on a map somewhere, looking at the planet, looking at the pictures, which I was looking at ESA, European Space Administration photos, which were way better than some of the photos that NASA was sending back a while back, and was able to see some things that were interesting, but not able to really track down my area. And I just would say this about what I know about the planet Mars. It's such an amazing place, and from what the locals have told me about what else is going on around the planet, it's something, we can look at it from the outside and see this big red ball, somehow think that there's this simple, mono ecosystem, mono habitat system, or non-habitated or monoculture, when I think it's very complicated. I think that who and what could be there and the number of different enclaves that they have and communities that they have, almost all underground, of course, at this point, are very wide and varied, from at least 2 different species of insectoid and reptoid, not to mention what I understand the cultural differences between the reptoid species at this point, which is quite varied, so they're not cohesive at all. They're not necessarily in like a constant state of war with each other. That's how they nearly destroyed their planet in the first place, so they don't do that so much anymore, but some of them are still very aggressive, and you don't necessarily just want to walk up and say, "Hey, how you going? Can I get a hug?" Because they still might eat you. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're, really hostile or warlike. They certainly have no intentions beyond the planet. They really would much rather sort out what's happening with their own world. They really don't care at all to go outside of their planet, to come here, go anywhere else, get involved in anybody else's business. They're very, very focused on what's happening in their neck of the woods, in their corner. Really could care less, to be honest, about anything that's happening outside their stratosphere, as long as it doesn't affect them. But I would say that my encounter with them, they're highly intelligent, highly organized, and have their own kind of interesting ethical premise of how they do things and why they do things. So I say that they have not only an intelligence and a technological intelligence and a scientific understanding and whatever you want to call their own psyche or psychological understanding of their own self and their own behavior and living things, but they also have an ethical and a moral center that may be defined by their own standards of ethics or morals, but nonetheless they have one. So I find that in this continued comparison of sort of what's more similar about us as a life form than what's different, that in that way they're very much like us, that they think, they feel, they understand technology, they have their own psychological behaviors, they have their own motivations for things, and they certainly have their own judgments about things and their own predisposed notions about things. But they also have their own, system of ethics and morals that is how it defines their existence and defines how they should go about what they do. So they're not just, barbarians or savages, running around doing whatever they feel like, so much as really being guided by whatever it is they consider their center ethic and moral to be, which my understanding is their connection with the planet. Their connection with their planet is their source of everything, in much way that our connection to our planet is our source of everything. So they feel their being connected to their planet is their way of staying true to their ethics and their morals and their behavior, and pretty much base everything they do on that. But my understanding in interacting with the northern tribes is that the southern tribes are quite a bit more hostile, quite a bit less friendly, quite a bit more likely just to engage in a fight with you, just to test your mettle, just to see if you're worthy of having a conversation with, or whether you're just worthy to be food. So certainly any diplomatic efforts to communicate or work or cooperate with them has to both be peaceful and from a point of strength. You can't just go open-armed and non-violent or they'll eat you, but you can't just go in aggressive or they'll think that you want a war. But if you can stand firm and strong and at the same time not be ready to want to burn them to the ground, then they're completely willing to respect us and have conversations with us. And that was my experience of them. The reptiles have, I would say, at least 3 distinct, I almost want to say, strains that are within the same species, that almost like a caste system, but not really so much a caste system, more like there's a warrior caste, and then there's kind of like everybody else. And so it's not so much that there's, the warrior caste is an upper caste or a lower caste so much as that they're just very specific to their job. And everyone else sort of finds whatever their job or skill within the community is to do. But the warrior class is really formidable. They can be anywhere from 7 feet to nearly 8 feet tall and hundreds of pounds. I mean, what I would say an equivalent, because the gravity coefficient is different, but I'd say the equivalent release between 450 and almost 500 pounds. They're huge. They have venom sacs. They spit, caustic venom, which is not fun. They're very strong, big claws. Their skin is really tough. They have 2 hearts and a double circulatory system, kind of a chest cavity internal organ system, and then an extremity system with hearts pumping both of those, and then sort of a capillary system that engages the 2 of them. But you have to cause blood pressure loss in both systems when you're fighting them to drop one. So they're really, really tough. You can't just shoot one in the heart and then have it drop. It will still come at you unless you get the other heart. But as I've also said before, we're the species from the heavy gravity planet when we go to Mars. So something that is large and strong there, I go to Mars and I'm way stronger than I am here. And, we had power-assisted body armor too. So we absolutely had sort of a more even in some cases, upper hand physically than they did because of our technological advantage and the fact that we came from a heavy gravity planet, compared to Mars anyway, a little bit heavier. But mentally, psionically, they were much more powerful than us. And when they would unleash their psionic attacks, it was really scary, to be honest. And just, I don't even know how to really try and put it into words other than that it would make you question your very presence in the reality that you're in, while at the same time subjecting your brain and your body to a level of pain, torture, anguish, or even bone breaking that you just would defy anything that you thought could be possible. That would just be, you would just, I'm not even sure how else to describe it except that it was so shocking and so altering of any reality that I understood to be real or false, but at the same time having a physical impact of breaking bones, breaking limbs, ripping people apart, that made it absolutely mentally, physically, and psychically shocking and very difficult to understand. But they didn't use it very often, which I really began to understand that they were not engaging with us in the way that they wanted to crush us. They were engaging in a way that was just, okay, sure, we'll show up for the fight. But when we really pushed them and tried to say, oh, yeah, look how tough we are, and they would go, oh, yeah, this is how tough we are, and they would really step it up a notch and crush us, absolutely crush us in the field. So, which brings me to the one point that I always want to make about them. We constantly hear people talk about draconians as being this very, very technologically powerful, very, very, very warlike, with few or any competitors in the galaxy that can stand up to them and, fight them on a good day. I would like to point out that there was few greater pleasures in my life than watching the native reptiles, the indigenous species reptiles of Mars, rout the draconians and mop up the floor with them like they were kindergartners. It was absolutely one of the most amazing things to see. And I just want to emphasize, for anyone militarily who thinks that we do not have the tactical upper hand or that we need a tactical upper hand when dealing with draconians, I'm telling you that you want to talk to the native reptoids of Mars, because they can kick their butt left, right, up, down, and any other which direction you would care to see them do it. We just have to either convince them to teach us how to do that, or convince them that it's within their interest and their motivation as being neighbors in the solar system to get involved. But I just want to point out that if there was ever a place where we were hoping to find a neighbor that could, help us stand up to a bully, that's really the neighbor we should be talking to, because they kick their butt hard. The only other thing I think that I would add to all of that is that my chain of command asked me to come public a year ago because they feel that the direction that this is headed has not been in the best interest of the people, has not been to legally reinforce constitutionality, U.S. code, law, military code of justice, all the legal systems that we consider to operate under and be the institutions of what keeps civilization civilized, have really been ignored badly, so badly that they feel they've done everything that they can at every meeting, filed every piece of paperwork, complained at the chain of command in every way that they see is feasible for them to do, to the point where they have to say, okay, we then have a legal right under this, Article 21 of the United States Marine Corps Special Section Special Code to allow an officer to, speak publicly and to break secrecy and to do these other things in order to reinforce the return to constitutionality, executive and legislative authority, to rogue systems that are essentially criminal and causing the downfall of everything. If you can bring these systems out of covertness, if you can bring them out of illegality, and you can bring them out of their rogue status, it's possible to bring them back into some form of rule of order, law, justice, and symmetry, and put that back into the infrastructure of a civilization and increase, shore up the civilization that's crumbling around us right now and bring it up to a state of something that can really move forward into the 21st century as a higher evolved, technologically advanced, sophisticated civilization, which we're just, very, very tiny away from being able to do if we just broke that wall of technological secrecy and we had access to all of the things that these covert programs have. Because clearly, when you start to look at what the major problems are, both social, economic, environmental, energy, medical, and you think, wow, gee, I sure wish we had some better technology that could fix them. As well, we do. And we have so much amazing technology that could fix these problems if they were applied and implemented towards them, that it becomes not just mean-spirited, but highly criminal, highly amoral, highly unethical, to the point where they are the treasonous, seditionous persons who are trying to destroy the very foundation of the civilization that we live in, which does not make them agitators, does not make them the other party, does not make them, like I said, mean-spirited. It makes them seditious, treasonous persons who are trying to destroy the very civilization that we stand upon. So trying to restore order, legal authority, and constitutionality to all this is part of what we're also trying to move towards and make people aware of. So we're not just trying to have the conversation of, hey, something is going on that you need to know about. We also want to really have the conversation that there are things that are going on that you don't know about that are illegal, and they need to be brought back into the umbrella of legality so that we can fix them. Because as long as they're under the umbrella of illegality, they will only be something that causes harm to the rest of us. As soon as we can bring those things back under the umbrella of legality and constitutional authority, then there's a hope to restoring civilization to the direction we want it to go. There we go.
Oh, perfect. Randy, I really appreciate all of this, and I know that, with all of your information, and this goes for each of you, it's very difficult to, cull it down into, a small piece like this. But thank you so much. Let's move on to Andrew D. Basiago. Andrew is a lawyer in private practice in Washington State, a writer, and a 21st century visionary. He holds not one, but 5 academic degrees, including a BA in history from UCLA and a Master of Philosophy from the University of Cambridge. Andy is a leading figure in the truth movement who is heading a campaign to lobby the United States government to disclose such controversial truths as the fact that Mars harbors life and that the United States has achieved quantum access to past and future events. He has been identified as the first of 2 major planetary whistleblowers predicted by Alta, the WebBot project that analyzes the content of the World Wide Web to discern future trends. Andy's writings place him at the forefront of contemporary Mars research. His paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, published in 2008, was the first work to prove that Mars is an inhabited planet. After publishing his landmark paper, Andy founded the Mars Anomaly Research Society. Andy is also one of America's time travel pioneers. In the late 1960s and early 70s, he was a child participant in the secret U.S. time-space program, Project Pegasus. He was the first American child to teleport and took part in probes to past and future events utilizing different forms of time travel, and then being researched and developed by DARPA. For 10 years, Andy has investigated his experiences in Project Pegasus on a quest to prove them and communicate them to others. Soon he will publish a tell-all book that will describe his awe-inspiring and terrifying experiences in Project Pegasus and the true story of the emergence of time travel in the U.S. defense community 40 years ago. It is always an honor to have you on the program. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Dream. It's an honor to be here, especially amidst such a distinguished panel involving, including Alfred Lambremont Webre, yourself, the wonderful Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, and the utterly fascinating gentleman that I've just had the pleasure of encountering for the first time, Randy Kramer. And I should add that while Randy was speaking, I was writing down different similarities and differences between our experiences just so we could distinguish them later in the program. I always like to clarify the point that I was in 2 distinctly different but to some extent related secret defense projects. You mentioned DARPA's Project Pegasus, which took place for me at least between 1968 and 72 when I was age 7 to 11. And then I was called back into government service in 1980, and again, relatively unwittingly and without my consent, was involved in the CIA's Mars Jump Room program. So let me take it forward from 1980, because of course today the focus of today's discussion is human visitation of Mars and the various covert U.S. projects that have been taking U.S. personnel to Mars. Really before 1980, because of course we have the account of Michael C. Relf having first gone up in 1976. In the summer of 1980, my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, who was a special projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company of Pasadena, California, one of the nation's leading and largest defense contractors, told me that he was going to be taking me to the Mount Shasta area for a father and son vacation. I had vacationed with my family beginning at age 3 in 1964. I was the youngest of 5, and so it was quite normal for us when we were on the East Coast to vacation in Maine and the Adirondacks in New York State. And after we moved to Southern California in 1972, right after my experiences in Project Pegasus ended as an 11-year-old, we began camping in California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia every summer. But what my dad informed me in around July of 1980 is that this year we would simply be going as father and son. My mother would not be going. My 4 older brothers and sisters would not be with us, but it would just be a special vacation between he and I. I had just completed a year of college, my freshman year, at UC San Diego with plans to enroll at UCLA in the fall. And when we drove early on a Saturday morning in August of 1980, it was the middle of 1980, and I've actually verified that by the fact that something very significant happened historically involving Lech Walesa, the Polish activist with Solidarity in Poland. And my dad was the son of Polish immigrants, so ethnically he was 100% Polish. So we were following Lech Walesa's career in Poland, and so I'm able to date the time we left the house for Mount Shasta as the middle of August of 1980 with high certainty. So we got up very early in the morning, attached the boat to our pickup truck, and began the trip from Chatsworth, California, in the Los Angeles region, up to the Mount Shasta area, which is a fairly long drive, but one that you can make if you start early enough in the morning. And as we got into the Shasta area, the strange things that would happen for the next 3.5 weeks began happening. The first strange thing was that we exited the I-5 corridor at exit 745, which, if you proceed for 9 miles north by northeast, you reach the town of McLeod, California. And there's a market there called the McLeod Market. In those days, the street that in front of it had not been made, and there was just kind of a sprawling blacktop that was irregular because they had just simply laid macadam over kind of an irregular surface. So the parking lot sort of had bumps in it. We kind of ambled into that parking lot with our vehicle and boat that we were towing. And my dad's attitude grew very serious because up to that point he had just told me that we were going on a vacation, which would have involved probably a lot of fishing and boating and water skiing. And he said, "Son, I'm going to be going into the McLeod Market here for about 15 minutes. I'll be back soon. Whatever you do not leave the car unless it's on fire or somebody forces you out at gunpoint. Do everything you can to stay with the vehicle. And I'll be out of the McLeod Market here in about 15 minutes." Well, as he promised, he did come out of the McLeod Market in 15 minutes, but with a 5-day growth of beard. And before he even really turned the key of the vehicle to move forward to Shasta and to our destination, which was Lake Siskiyou, which would have been actually Lake Siskiyou is at exit 739. So he actually went 6 miles, or at least 6 freeway exits north of our destination to go into the McLeod Market. And I said, "Dad, what happened?" And he goes, "What do you mean, son?" And I said, "Well, you have a 5-day growth of beard. Where'd you get that in 15 minutes?" And he said, "Oh, I always let my beard grow when we go camping." And I said, "Dad, that just doesn't cut it. You were clean shaven, and now you look like you've been somewhere else for 5 days." And he said, "No, son, my beard just must be growing quickly. I always let it grow like this when we're camping. You've known that since you were a small child." And so I think what probably happened, especially since there had to have been a passage of time. I mean, when we're time traveling, we age in the ordinary diurnal sense. The whole notion that H.G. Wells propagated, that you accelerate in time-space, and hence your biological activities accelerate, which has been talked about extensively during the space age, that, for example, going into outer space would arrest aging slightly, is not true. What happens with time travel is you go places quickly, and then while you're there in quantum displacement, you age in the ordinary diurnal sense, and then you're often returned to the time of your point of embarkation, which means that you've aged biologically in a way that is not reflected in your historical age. So, for example, during his career on Project Pegasus, my dad spent 8 years in quantum displacement in New Mexico. So when he died in 1990, historically at age 66, he was actually biologically 74 years of age. And he and Raymond Kubik, the man who introduced my parents in life and their marriage resulted, spent the better part of an afternoon at Parsons one day calculating that my father, in fact, was 8 years older biologically than his historical age as a result of the quantum displacement in New Mexico. Okay, so he had to have been quantum displaced and then come back for his biological aging to have reflected a 5-day growth of his beard. My dad had black hair as a young man and a very full black beard, even though he was white-haired by that age. In 1980, he was already 57, having been born in 1923. So he was 57 historically, but let's do the math here. 65 biologically, although he was 57 chronologically. We always used to kid him about looking like Ernest Hemingway when we were camping because of his white hair and his dark beard. Clearly he had been sent somewhere. But I really couldn't get much traction with my dad. I mean, he was career CIA. He had first entered the U.S. government responses to the extraterrestrial presence. In 1952, he had been working at Okanite Corporation, or Okanite Company in Paramus, New Jersey. He had a military officer appear at his desk at Okanite, and he was given military orders to report at the Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Wood Ridge, New Jersey, the next Monday, to work on, he would learn, the ramjet engine project, which he designed the metallurgy for. The ramjet was going to be a space plane that would function in our atmosphere and our near-Earth environment to intercept and chase extraterrestrial craft out of our atmosphere and near-Earth environment. That project of October 1952 that my dad was summoned into by the government, followed by several months, the very famous July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C. By 9 extraterrestrial craft clocked at Langley Air Force Base as traveling at 7,000 miles per hour, which was far beyond the flight capability of any craft in the world at that time, both American and Soviet, for example. And so my dad was brought in as an engineer to something that, of course, Laura's great-grandfather, President Eisenhower, would cope with following his election as President of the United States in November 1952, which was the fact that after World War II and the advent of atomic weaponry, we clearly had put other groups, other planetary civilizations on notice that we not only were here in this area of the cosmos, the spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy, 165 million light years from its relative center, but that we were doing something extremely cosmically foolish, which was destroying the physical substrates of the universe through nuclear fission by blowing up atomic bombs. And so my dad was in a very pressured professional status really from that time forward until his retirement in 1984. He not only worked on the ramjet and designed a metallurgical alloy that would allow it to not melt from friction by contact with molecules of air in our atmosphere and particles of space dust when it went into outer space. But he designed the instrumentation for the strategic bomber, which was known as the B-70, which was going to be the flying Chernobyl, the atomic powered strategic bomber. And sometime in the mid-1960s, he was called into Project Pegasus to work on the development of time travel, utilizing ultimately eight different modalities of time travel for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was then known not as DARPA, but as ARPA. Now, was my dad qualified to do that? Yes. In fact, he was an honors graduate in engineering from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where he had done half of his course of studies in electrical engineering, which is very germane to time travel and teleportation. Essentially, Tesla teleportation is an electrical engineering application. And he had done the other half of his course of studies, 25% in physics and 25% in math. My father was a brilliant mathematician. In fact, when he was working at the Thomas A. Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey, after leaving Curtiss Wright, where he was employed from 1956 to 64, and as he would later say, we were on the precipice of developing time travel at the Edison Labs, where among his colleagues was J.B. Johnson, who had discovered white noise in 1928. So there were just some distinguished physicists and engineers at that think tank. He had was performing for those 8 years at the Edison Labs. primarily mathematical proofs of the operation of dozens of electronic components that were ultimately purchased by Robert Noyce, and through that ingathering of different devices, Intel Corporation was founded. So my dad was actually doing mathematical tests of the sufficiency of electronic components that became part of the hardware bulwark of the personal computer revolution later, after the founding of Intel Corporation by Noyce and the advances of the Fairchild 8, who were included individuals like Dr. William Shockley. So he was brought into Project Pegasus sometime in the mid-1960s. In 1966, he joined Parsons-Jordan Corporation. I believe that Parsons-Jordan was the initial cover for the time travel program Project Pegasus. Ostensibly, it had a single client, which was Alcoa, the copper manufacturer, and a single contract, which was the Alcoa copper contract in Chile. And my dad made many trips to Chile to consult, not Alcoa, but Anaconda Corporation. Alcoa is the aluminum manufacturer, but the copper manufacturer was Anaconda, and it had major holdings in Chile. So my dad was in Chile before and after the rise and fall, the toppling of Salvador Allende as president of Chile. And I know around that time of the fall of Allende, which was very brutal and anti-democratic, my father was performing intelligence operations for the CIA. I was even present when a local CIA technician in our hometown of Morris Plains, New Jersey, showed my father a small camera with which he could take covert photographs in Chile. So, like many of our fathers and mothers during the Cold War working for these top defense contractors, they had a sort of a second identity as a member of the intelligence community. In fact, my dad had an alternate name and alternate identification papers as Henry Przybylski, who was a high school friend of his while he was growing up in Summit Hill, Pennsylvania, who had tragically been killed as a combat fatality in World War II. And the CIA had used Henry Przybylski's identity to afford my dad a second covert identity in what was called the Second Reserve of the U.S. Army, which as a major allowed him the capacity to get on different military bases, different defense contractor locations that were under armed guard. And I know that because my dad once took me up to Camp Kilmer, the Army base, the sprawling Army base in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And after showing his credentials, his identification, the guard stepped back from our vehicle and saluted my father and said, "You may proceed, Major." And I turned to my dad and said, "Dad, I thought you were private first class as an ambulance driver and combat medic in France and Germany during the war." I didn't say that, but I'm providing that information now. I said, "Dad, I thought you were a private during the war." And he said, "I was, but now I'm a major in this secret fifth column," he put it, that the U.S. government has maintained, which is called the Second Reserve, and we're going to be called up and become the frontline political and military leadership of the country if, for example, we're invaded by the Soviet Army and our civilian leadership and our standing military leadership are captured or killed. So my dad was definitely immersed in not just defense work, but in covert intelligence work and continuity of government activities by the time I was 4 or 5 years old. Like I'm dating it from 1966 when he joined Parsons-Jordan. It just was incredible, by the way, that Parsons-Jordan would just have one contract, being the copper contract with Anaconda. Now, I was called into Project Pegasus myself unofficially when I teleported from Curtiss-Wright to the Santa Fe, New Mexico State Capitol grounds with my father, and we've dated that to probably with a pretty high degree of certainty my first grade year, specifically around February of 1968. So Tesla teleportation was fully operational in the defense technical community 25 years after Tesla's passing in January of 1943, because I found myself starting to teleport with my dad beginning in winter of 1968 when I was age 6. The other major component of Project Pegasus primarily was chronovision, the ability to propagate a holographic image of a past or future event, so you could use it as a looking glass if you looked at the hologram. But if the hologram was formed around you, you would experience going to that past or future time and place. So those were my major activities in Pegasus, primarily teleporting back and forth between the country, going to primarily past locations via chronovision, and then participating in some truly experimental activities, for example, with other forms of physical time travel, including plasma confinement, where a radioactive plasma field is created around you to displace you in time, and also the jump rooms that we would later take to Mars were under development right as I was leaving Project Pegasus as an 11-year-old in 71-72. So I know that the Mars jump rooms were already under development in Project Pegasus, and in that sense, Pegasus can be viewed as a knock-on activity or a continuation. The Mars jump room program can be viewed as a sort of a knock-on activity of Project Pegasus. My colleague Bernard Mendez, my fellow U.S. chrononaut and Mars jumper, believes that Project Pegasus actually included all of these programs where forms of quantum manipulation, that is time travel, were utilized, including the Mars jump room program. So we then moved to California. I had a very, obviously, stressful adolescence. Adolescence is always kind of tough. As the new kid from New Jersey in Southern California, and I attended junior high school and high school at Chatsworth High School in Chatsworth, California. I ultimately adapted to California and enjoyed myself immensely in high school, and I was the editor-in-chief of the school paper. I was playing saxophone in the school musical groups. I was wrestling, and I think I graduated with honors, and after being voted by my peers most respected and most likely to succeed. So by the time I left high school, I clearly was a well-adjusted individual, despite the move from New Jersey and, adapting to a different culture in suburban Los Angeles than suburban New Jersey. So I certainly was known in my community by the time I graduated from high school, and based on something that Courtney Hunt, one of the CIA trainers for the jump room program, stated, I think, believe it or not, I think being voted to those honors in my senior superlatives may have actually been recorded by the government, because when I asked him why I was selected, he basically referenced those honors, which is really amazing if you think about it, that the CIA could literally be monitoring a high school graduate regarding their senior superlatives. So I initially went to my freshman year down to UC San Diego because I was interested in studying writing, actually majoring in literature and taking courses in the writing program there and maybe becoming a science writer. I was thinking about becoming a lawyer back then, which I am now. Here in the state of Washington, I'm a lawyer in private practice, admitted to the Washington State Bar Association and the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington. So I've been practicing law for almost 20 years with no disciplinary history, no psychiatric issues, no history of drug or alcohol dependence, not even a client complaint. So I've now earned some credibility as a pillar of the community in Vancouver, Washington, where I've been practicing law for those almost 20 years. So I go off to UC San Diego, again, just like junior high and high school, nothing particularly strange happens. But then, summer of 80, year after my freshman year, my dad has taken me to the Shasta area, and he has gone on a 5-day disappearing act through a modest grocery store in McLeod, California. And so for those who know the Shasta area, they realize how absurd that sounds. I mean, this is a grocery store with cold drinks and fishing bait in it. Okay, it's not some kind of hardened government facility. So we then double back to the camping area at Shasta at north of Lake Siskiyou. There's a campground on the northern shores of Lake Siskiyou off of exit 739, and we pitch our tent and begin setting up the campground. Being in the Army like that, my dad knew what to do with a shovel. Okay, he was kind of raising us to be capable to cope out in the woods. And so we got our campground set up very quickly. And about an hour later, a car arrived, and a father and son relatively close to our age stepped out. And they were Thomas J. Stillings, who was about 12 years younger than my dad. He was more or less in his 40s. And his son, younger than I, William Brett Stillings, Brett was then 13, I was 18, stepped out of their van. It was a distinctly pumpkin orange van, we remember. And without even setting up their tent, or their popping up, the tent device on their van, came over to our campground. And the first thing that Thomas J. Stillings announced to my father as he was shaking his hand was, "You may not know me, but we're employed by the same company." And he emphasized the word company. This, of course, was locutionary communication to indicate that they were both CIA, members of the company, the CIA. We then commiserated, and my dad said it was explained how he was employed by Parsons. Thomas J. Stillings, who had served in the U.S. Navy as a lieutenant when he was younger, described how he was employed as an operations analyst with Lockheed Skunk Works of Burbank, California. I would learn during my investigation that the Mars Jump Room program was a joint venture of Parsons and Lockheed, and hence that may explain why from that moment on in the campground, Brett Stillings and I were sort of twinned as young men from Southern California who would ultimately take the jump room to Mars. Then we pretty much just sat around in lawn chairs, and when we were doing that, Tom Stillings had Brett go back to their camper and get a shoebox. And Brett brought that back to our campsite and said, and then Tom Stillings opened the shoebox and said, "I don't have to show this to you, Ray, because you're presently working with this." So now here we have Tom Stillings aware of the fact that my dad was working in anti-gravitic applications. By the way, anti-gravity is a misnomer. Anti-gravitic devices are reverse magnetic in the same way that when you put the common pole of two magnets together and they naturally repel each other, the anti-gravitic craft are reverse magnetic, interacting with the polarity of metals in the ground, just as this small piece of what Tom Stillings called an example of boundary layer material was. Okay, and so here we have Tom Stillings in possession of some kind of exotic technology or exotic material, as it were. We then sit around the campfire. We retire. The next day we get up. We fix breakfast. We again sit around the campsite just talking. And promptly at 1 p.m., my father and Thomas J. Stillings stood up, just bolt upright. They just got out of their lawn chairs and walked purposefully on an angle towards an adjacent campsite. Brett and I, being 13 and 18, and quite spry compared to our middle-aged dads, ran ahead of them in the direction that they were going, in this diagonal across the campgrounds. And we walked between a vehicle and it was a sort of a car and a camper. And as we were making our way through that narrow passage, we were confronted by somebody who we certainly knew as children of the 1960s. I was born in 61, Brett in 1966. And that was astronaut Edwin Aldrin, Jr., that is to say, Buzz Aldrin. And he confronted us sort of in front of the vehicles before he sort of repelled us, and we sort of stepped back a couple as he came through the passage between the two vehicles. And so we're now in front of his campsite, in front of the vehicles. And this is almost a verbatim statement of what he said, because one of the reasons I was selected for Project Pegasus as ultimately, I guess, an 8-year-old in fall of 1969, officially, when it was officially brought into Pegasus, is I have a very capable memory. So I can go back to conversations that were held decades ago and remember almost precisely what was said. And what Buzz Aldrin said to us is, "Andy, Brett, pleased to meet you, fellas. Well, let me tell you, you're going to be doing something in a short period of time that I did a few years back, and that's go off planet. And let me tell you, fellas, it's going to be the opportunity of a lifetime." And Brett and I kind of looked at each other quizzically, like, was Buzz Aldrin joking? Why is Buzz Aldrin in this campsite, this campground? How did our fathers know he was here? What I later found out from Brett, actually, after Brett contacted me in March of 2010, is that when his father brought him to the Lake Siskiyou campgrounds, he also stopped at the McLeod Market and then came out of the market in 15 minutes with a 3-day growth of beard after shaving in the car. In other words, Tom Stilling shaved with an electric battery-powered or dash-powered shaver in the car, and then went into the McLeod Market and came out with a little bit less beard growth than my father, but maybe about 3 days of beard. So clearly our fathers were being tracked in something, and I speculate that whatever meeting they participated in for 5 days, whatever 5-day seminar they attended after taking the teleport under the McLeod Market or wherever they went, I think that astronaut Edwin Aldrin must have also been a participant because he knew our names and he knew our dads. There would have been a second reason for Buzz Aldrin to know my father, which is that in 1967 my dad had been investigated and cleared by the FBI to work on the instrumentation for the lunar module, and my father showed me the schematics for that project, labeled or entitled Lunar Landing Assembly Process, which was the classic setup, of the LEM being extruded from the front of the command module and reattaching and then being put down on the surface of the moon, and then the top blasting off to get off the moon, and everything that Jules Bergman would have described to us when the lunar landing happened. So I think that the relationship between Buzz Aldrin and my dad may have gone back to the lunar landing. Certainly they were both on it. At least my dad was on it initially before the contract to do that instrumentation went to Grumman rather than Parsons. Parsons Jordan obviously was where my dad had just been, and he left and joined Parsons about a year later. So his first project at Parsons apparently was going to be the instrumentation for the LEM. And of course, my dad had the background with the space planes and so forth, like the Ramjet engine project. Okay, so
Andy, let's start pulling this together. I've got to stick with the time constraints here. So
yeah, I wanted to go long because I know that we had 25 minutes, so I'll be less detailed. So that night in the campground, my dad announces that Brett and I are going to be enrolled in a local educational experience to go to learn everything about Mars. And when I asked him, why do we have to take this Mars seminar here this summer in the Shasta region, he said, because some of you kids in the program are going to be going there. The next morning, which we think was that first Monday in the middle of August of 80, we went up to the annex of College of the Siskiyous in Wairika, California, and we met the young people enrolled. We have identified 5 of those 10 young people. In addition to Brett Stillings and myself, our fellow students included Barry Sotoro, a student at Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, who we now know as President Barack Obama, Regina Elvira Dugan, who was then an undergraduate at Caltech at a young age, who would then become the first female director and the 19th director of DARPA after being appointed by President Obama on 7/2009, which was the 40th anniversary of the lunar landing, and also the future NASA pilot and astronaut who died aboard Space Shuttle Columbia in February of 2003, namely William Cameron McCool. We were variously, Brett was 13, Regina was 17, I was 18, William McCool was 5 years younger than myself, so he was 18, and Barry Sotoro, that is to say Barry Obama, had just turned 19 on August 4th of 80. So that was the age range, not only of the 5 of us we've been able to identify, but of the 5 other participants that we have not been able to name. We have been able to name, however, everybody else in the room, including Bernard Mendez, who was then sort of an intelligence agent attached to the U.S. Air Force, who it was explained would audit the class and participate in our jump room experiences to investigate the project. We've been able to, all 3 of us, that is to say myself, William B. Stillings, and Bernard Mendez, have engaged in hundreds of hours of consultation on Skype and personally, and have identified our Mars training officer as Major Ed Dames, the remote viewing pioneer, who was then serving as a scientific and technical intelligence officer for the U.S. Army. And also, I've been able to identify the 4 parents who audited most of the class, namely my father Raymond, William Stillings' father Thomas Stillings, Barack Obama's putative mother, who may very well have simply been his adoptive mother and handler, a woman by the name of Stanley Ann Dunham, and frequently the mother of Regina Dugan was also auditing the class as a parent of one of the participants. We did 3.5 weeks of training from roughly mid-August to the end of the first week of September. Several days, however, before the conventional course ended, Ed Dames and my father approached myself, Barry, and Regina and announced that they were going to teleport us to the beginning of the summer in June, and we would be sequestered for several months, and each of us analyzing 4 inches of French intelligence documents about the planet Mars, about the human civilization on Mars, to give each of our theses as to whether or not the human civilization on Mars represented a threat to our human civilization on Earth, did not, or it could not be determined. I concluded that it did not, that we were the hegemons on Mars, because, for example, that French dossier, all of it in the French language, so I was able to only translate about 25% of it, indicated that several American astronauts died on the surface of Mars in 1964 after the Martian humanoid civilization promised to rescue them and then reneged. So that anecdote in the French dossier that we were asked to analyze for the CIA, by the way, indicated that there was a human civilization. We had some way of contacting it, presumably through some form of advanced radio, and that it had engaged in a, not a duplicitous way, but sort of a dichotomous way with our civilization by agreeing remotely to rescue several of our astronauts who were on Mars, and then declined, which indicates that they weren't necessarily allies of ours. And then also it indicates, of course, that we had a presence on Mars no later than 1964. And I'm absolutely certain about that year because that was when I was 3. I remember and so forth.
So, Andy, why don't you just go ahead and sum up for us?
Well, so then I ended up first jumping to Mars from a jump room in El Segundo, California in July of 81, the next summer. I ended up doing about 40 round trips to Mars from that July 81 to my last jump, which is in May of 84. And sitting here and listening to Randy, I can say that there are many points of similarity and some points of divergence. And so I hope that we can discuss those today.
Oh, absolutely. I'm certainly hoping those things we can discuss as well. Those are some of my most interesting questions that I have to talk about as well. Thank you, Emil.
Excellent. Really loving all this interaction and some really great information. Let's go ahead and introduce Laura Eisenhower. Laura is a global alchemist and cosmic mythologist and is the great-granddaughter of President Dwight David Eisenhower. She is an internationally acclaimed speaker who has presented her work worldwide. She is considered by many to be one of North America's leading researchers on health, exopolitics, alchemy, metaphysics, and ancient history. In addition, Laura holds degrees and certifications in science, wilderness expedition leadership, and natural healing. For 15 years, Laura has been providing readings with the assistance of many divination tools and astrology. Laura also shares about her attempted recruitment to go to a colony on Mars that represented a timeline that she refused to go along with. She's been able to uncover some necessary truths and agendas about humanity, or that humanity is being kept in the dark about. Laura works to free us from the 3D holographic time loop and guide us back to the pleroma, the totality of divine powers. With great passion and courage, she is helping to return sacred union, divine wisdom, and the many faces of the goddess that have been buried and forgotten for thousands of years. It's always a distinct pleasure to introduce you, Laura. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. Just to go a little bit into my background, obviously, being raised in this family has been an interesting thing because there's just a lot there that happened in Eisenhower's administration that we don't hear about, and actually things that weren't discussed in the family. Went to a lot of different family events, have been, very much a participant in the family, and as far as, holidays and just, being a very active member of the family, none of this was discussed. Things connected to Mars or extraterrestrials or UFOs, but the rumors have been there, and they've always been something that has caught my eye. I saw some headlines about ET's meeting with Eisenhower in Weekly World magazine, and it started to make me think, because from a very young age I knew I had a mission, and it wouldn't leave me alone, and I was almost too young to fully understand it, but it was all I could think about, it was all I could process, and it had a lot to do with the state of the planet, the imbalance of the masculine and feminine, and the dark agendas that are just really infiltrated within our government structure, religion, and just pretty much everything. And so, of course, as I got older, I saw that more clearly, but energetically, I was extremely sensitive to it. And I got a lot of interesting information and intuitive insights, and even some contact from what seemed to be a benevolent ET race concerning timelines and the window period of 2012, and how it represented the opening of the natural stargates, and how this was very linked to my path. So, not to get into too much about any kind of contact, it was enough to really trigger a whole bunch of stuff. I really started to look at, what timelines are all about and what this window period is all about. It's definitely talked about, prophesized. We hear about it in the Mayan calendar. We hear about it from all sorts of people making predictions. And this is, the time that we really have an opportunity to advance ourselves and expand into higher earth energies, and to really come into balance and unification on a level that has to do with our DNA and how it relates to the stargates on the planet, much more so than just everybody being in the same room together, learning to get along. It goes a little bit deeper than that, because we have to move away from a lot of the programmings and conditionings that have prevented us from unifying on a level that works. And so this other agenda that was very clear to me had to do with the absolute and total destruction of our natural resources, the total control of humanity, the distortions and programmings of the masculine and feminine, and all the false flags of war and all the conflict throughout thousands of years of history that have made it very difficult for us to look at one another and feel that unity and feel that camaraderie and that sense of purpose about what we need to do as a collective. Relationships are targeted. Sacred union, is targeted in the sense that it's already targeted within us. There's a lot of imbalance within our own nature, which makes it very difficult to create that outside of ourselves. And so with that and the need for unification being what's most crucial and what's most attacked, we really need to pay attention to all this. And so being in the Eisenhower family and seeing the trees with ETs, you can't help but think, okay, well, this is connected to one of these timelines, and that there's deals being made or something's happening that is very ancient in our history that has led to this sort of distinction between what's in front of us. And of course, there's multiple timelines. Some have a lot more to do with our sovereignty and our empowerment and our ability to function as a global society with our universal galactic society. And the other is the secrecy, the hidden agendas, the use and abuse of humanity as far as lies and deceits, and taking our tax dollars to pretty much fund black ops projects and all sorts of hidden agendas that we don't have a say about. And that trajectory has a lot also to do with the chemtrails, weather modification, geoengineering, and all the different things that are attempting, which already have and are already doing, controlling nature and creating superstorms and natural disasters. So there's a simulation timeline that appears to be real to people that haven't looked deep enough, and then one that's organic. And the one that's organic seems to be a lot more out of reach for people compared to, the masses who pretty much nod their head at anything the government tells them, which is why we have TSA in the airports that people more than happily walk through without question. It wasn't until 9/11 that the doors or the window or everything really got blown open. And so now is an opportunity to really understand. And so everything about all this has been my process throughout my whole life. I've always connected with Ike. He was always with me as a child, and I was always thinking, who is this man that just keeps showing up? I know he's a family member, but, there's something really here that's grabbing me on a soul level and taking me on this journey into something so vast that I eventually had to almost live a double life. I couldn't communicate it to anybody. Everything I was sensing and feeling, all the different sensitivities and pain and anguish I was going through as well, not just, because of the state of the planet, but I was also targeted. I was pre-identified in Project Pegasus that Andrew has talked about in 1972 before I was born. I'm sure, he has more solid information about that to share, but the whole point is pretty much from day one, or even before that, there's been attention on me to steer me towards going off-planet and going down this timeline that represents Alternative 3 agenda and what seems to be a New World Order agenda. It probably didn't start off that way, which we're learning more about from, folks like Randy, Captain K, same person, and just, Andrew Basiago and Alfred Webre and everybody we have here that is working real hard on their own missions as we come together and connect dots. So at some point in my path, because of this targeting, I just couldn't handle being controlled anymore. No matter what I did or tried to attempt to do for my life, there was just something that was knocking me out of my body. There was interferences that were beyond my own comprehension. I used to always kind of take responsibility and say, wow, I must really be out of balance, or something must be really screwed up in me for all these disasters to constantly happen and all these manipulations and all these strange people coming into my life, attacking me and doing all this. I'm like, man, what is going on here? And I knew intuitively that it wasn't coming from me, that there was, and I know that there's a part of me that I needed to strengthen to deflect it, but I knew that there was some sort of outer attack, and that I could use that outer attack to make me strong and to use it as a tool for my empowerment and for my ability to stand in my truth and share what I'm sharing today, rather than let it do what their goal was, which was to get me to do what they wanted me to do. And so I went to a clairvoyant institute, and I kind of stumbled upon it accidentally, and they confirmed to me that indeed I was being targeted by psychotronic weaponry, invisible things that you just can't point out or identify really, and that basically they were trying to control me. And even the visitation I had when I was young, said that, they're going to try and destroy you and take you away. And of course, when you're young, you only have, bits and pieces, but I had a lot of, interesting dreams along the way. And basically, at that point in my life, I was just trying to get my life back. I was very, very involved in trying to understand the nature of reality, being very open to, exopolitics and just, off-planet beings, benevolent beings, and just how we're connected with it, and how we're made of so much more, and we used to, be in a much more higher dimensional DNA capacity that we aren't anymore. And through just feeling the wounds of the planet and just a lot of the suffering on the planet, I let that take me into the zone of what it is we're wanting to call back. What are we trying to recover? Why are we suffering so much? Obviously, we're suffering because something's missing. Well, let's find that missing link instead of be a victim to this and allow it to continue. So when I stopped my life and said I can't stand being controlled anymore, and I said I'm just going to surrender and see where these forces take me, because I couldn't go against that current anymore. It was just too strong, and I knew that I had to contend with it to really get my life back. It wasn't going to go away, and it was manipulating people that were coming into my life. There was, plants that were set up that was confirmed later on that specific people that they had the name of would be put in place in my life with me so that I would be much more easily controlled. And so I gave up, and then all of a sudden I found myself, moving from Santa Rosa, California back to Washington, D.C. in the basement of my mother's house. Always that, great place you go when nothing else is really working out, to get my bearings straight and to figure out what the hell was going on. It wasn't too long after that I just ended up, going to a camping trip, a gathering where there was a lot of other campers, and, it was an event that was going on. And I ran into somebody who, made conversation with me and approached me and was very interested in getting to know me. And, we formed a connection, and then I went back to D.C., and I was visited by this person who was going to secret meetings in Washington and was very sort of hush-hush about it, but was giving me little tidbits, like we're planning to go to Mars, and, you're a part of this, and it's really for your protection. You might not fully understand it, but, basically we need to get off planet because of potential catastrophes and cataclysms and all this different stuff going on. And they brought up, Eisenhower, and they brought up, well, it was this one individual that said, it connects to some things that Eisenhower knew about. I wasn't getting any other conversations than the person that, came to me, but I did hear all the names. of the people he was dealing with. But I was supposed to be very quiet about it because it was still in the works. And immediately, there was just no way I was going to go. I knew that in my heart because from an early age, I knew I had a very powerful mission, and it was very clear to me what that mission was, and it had everything to do with staying here on Earth, helping people to awaken and to understand what we're made of and what our potential is, particularly during the window period of 2012, when we can, really move into higher Earth energies as the activation of the natural stargates is taking place. Still grounded, still, in our physical embodiments, but upgrading, upgrading into a more conscious level of awareness and activating our spiritual abilities and all sorts of things. So I knew that there was just no way. And then the conversation sort of got dropped. I think they said, you better not say too much. But there were enough emails I was able to save, and those emails were talking about things like looking glass technologies, something called the Orion's Cube, and a lot about, all the different things that are happening that would lead us to need to go off planet. And the person that approached me to recruit me that I had a partnership with, basically was telling me that he was getting communication from an off-planet race that was saying that this needed to be done. And so I really started to investigate a lot, and what I sensed that it wasn't even a legitimate ET race, that somehow this was being artificially sent to him, and that the people that were wanting to go to Mars that had brought him into their circle were the ones behind creating the abduction or contact scenarios that were giving him the information about going to Mars. And I felt that they were all connected, that this wasn't just some isolated group that he ended up getting in touch with because he had gotten some communication and, he was rallying the troops like the physicists and these different people that had alien technology, because they're a faction of MJ-12, so I can't imagine that he would just call upon them. What I sensed is that they pulled him in, and because he was getting communications about going to Mars, they were curious, and then they were getting his downloads, and then they were sort of answering to it, while in my eyes they were behind it all along, and they had set it up. And so they were programming him on a patriotic level, convincing him that this was to, really help humanity. And yes, it does make sense that it's important to protect the human genome, but when it becomes an agenda that compromises most of humanity and benefits only some and not others, and keeps technologies that could help the planet from being available, and a whole list of other things that are absolutely and totally unethical, it just, the more I found out, the more shocking it got. And no matter how positively presented it was, my intuition took me in a journey that helped me to uncover what was really going on. I had prophetic dreams, and it didn't happen until after I moved to North Carolina to be with this partner, and the reason that happened was because the whole topic got dropped, and it was sort of like, oh, not a big deal. Maybe it's some future plan because we are going to go off planet, and we have, NASA and the shuttle to the moon, and I knew that that was kind of a facade, but it wasn't so heavy anymore. And I thought that this wasn't as deep of an agenda as I eventually found out. And like I said, along the way I was finding out as much as I could, but it was usually after the topic came up again. So by the time I had gotten a grip on it, I was already moved in with this person, and I had a dream that I was being taken up into a ship by chains, and a voice from the sky said, they'll basically control you and use you, and you have a choice right now to do your mission or to go with them. And there was more to it than that, but I obviously chose to stay here. And I fell out of the ship, landed in the water. I could feel the coldness of the water. It was extremely lucid. And then I wanted to fly back up to the ship and grab whoever else. And then there was lightning and thunder, and there was nothing I could do. I landed in the water, and then there was a planetary alignment, the sky filled with light, and the indication was, you had made the right choice. I had made the right choice. And then I woke up, and I had to go about, pulling myself out of this situation because it just got more and more dramatic all the time. Every time he wanted to share something with me, because after I shared that dream, he knew I was onto them. So every time he would give himself the opportunity to give me insights into what was going on, he had to pull apart the computer systems, all the batteries, the cell phone batteries, and all electronics, because we were basically being monitored. And he would tell me what he knew and why I was recruited and what this was really about. And he said, they want you to reseed a new civilization on Mars, and they know about your kids, they know all about your past lives, they know everything through this looking glass technology, and you've been, chosen or whatever. And then all of a sudden, he would get a phone call, and he would get some sort of code over the phone, and he would disappear and be on missions and hardly remember, and then deny everything that he said. So it just got really, really dramatic. The more I resisted going, the more intense and dangerous it got. And the topics would only come up about going to Mars every time I felt, somewhat settled and felt that, I was going to be able to complete my mission and they might actually listen to me and give me a voice and have me, have a say about going off planet and what we can do here on this Earth to have the best of both worlds, which is diplomacy with the beings on Mars or whatever's going on Mars, or some sort of awareness about it that we could share with the human race. I didn't know the stuff that I'm learning now, that Randy and Andrew are talking about. At the time, there was no Project Camelot, and I didn't know them, but I sensed that, there was at least a colony. So the part about races being there in the diplomacy, it came much later after, collaborating with these folks and talking with them, knowing a lot more about the picture, and that started in 2010. And I knew there was beings there, and I knew diplomacy was important, but I really needed to understand, those that had been there and what their stories were to even know where we could even begin the conversation. But anyway, it was all sort of floating around knowing that, there can be a win-win situation. Something good can come out of this. I was absolutely silenced. I never had a voice. There was nothing I could do. I got nothing but attacked. And it was difficult to survive. I don't need to go into all that because we all have our stories about what those targets are like. But I eventually decided to talk on the phone about it. And a friend of mine who is a witness to all this, who spoke in Examiner.com, which you can read about on exopolitics.com, is a testimony to this because I shared with her, and she ended up getting brought into it. Was curious about it and interested. And then when I refused to go, I voiced it on the phone, and I could tell that the phones were being tapped. And once I declared it and found my space from the attacks and moved away from the house that I was with, was living with him, the attacks started to subside. And then in 2010, that's when I did the article with Alfred, and the attacks got a little bit less, but they still continue. They still continue all the time. But there's a lot more safety in sharing this information and having transparency than trying to manage it in the background. So the times we are in right now really involve the importance of bringing this information out there. It's not just talking about the fact that there's life on Mars. It's really about preserving the sovereignty of the human race and getting things on track here on Mother Earth and having our priorities set. And this is what I love about this panel, because they all have a similar vision. And we want to, pretty much take the reins and maybe do this right and do this out of respect for, everybody involved that has a heart in the right place, and to call out all the ones that, have chosen, service to self or unethical behaviors and abuses and traumas for the sake of benefiting at the cost of everybody else's freedom. And this is where we are today, and, it's going to be interesting how it plays out, but I'm just grateful that I was able to get away from it, and I'm grateful that I had this family background to give me that extra strength, and I know that that is also why I was recruited. But I was recruited to be a permanent colonist, so my piece of the story is that I back up what both Captain K and Andrew Basiago are saying, even though I don't feel like I even need to, because they're brilliant and they're articulate and they're intelligent, and how can anybody really doubt it? But my part of the story is that there was a reason I was going to be a permanent colonist. It connects to the balancing that needs to take place with the masculine and feminine here on Mother Earth. I work with the earth energies, the cosmic energies, in a very multidimensional way, working to clear the wormholes and stargates from all that has clogged them up, that is trying to prevent us from taking this leap into a higher earth energies, and that's my part in it. And to say that if they've gone through all this and I got recruited to go to Mars to be a permanent colonist, then I can pretty much safely say, on top of other whistleblowers like Michael Ralph, that this is the truth, and this is Alternative 3, and it's time for us to all look at it and step up in our own lives, figure out our purpose, and empower what needs to be empowered so that we can have a positive future and heal this planet and heal ourselves.
Excellent, Laura. Thank you so much for sharing. Let's move right on to Alfred Webre. Alfred's book, Exopolitics, A Decade of Contact, came out in the year 2000. He founded Exopolitics, the science of relations among intelligent civilizations in the multiverse. Using advanced quantum access technology, the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and the CIA time-traveled Alfred's book, Exopolitics, Politics, Government, and Law in the Universe, 2005, from 2005 back to 1971, when an unwitting Alfred was examined by a group of approximately 50 CIA and DARPA officials who knew Alfred would be a leading future extraterrestrial and time travel whistleblower and would become the developer of the exopolitics and dimensional ecology models of the omniverse. Alfred's new book, The Dimensional Ecology of the Omniverse, integrates empirical data from intelligent extraterrestrial civilizations and from the intelligent civilizations of souls in the interlife and demonstrates a new hypothesis of a functioning ecology of intelligence in the dimensions in the omniverse. Alfred is a graduate of Yale University and Yale Law School in international law and was a Fulbright scholar in international economic integration in Uruguay. He has taught economics at Yale University and constitutional law at the University of Texas. Alfred was general counsel to the New York City Environmental Protection Administration, a futurist at Stanford Research Institute, where he directed the proposed 1977 Carter White House extraterrestrial communication study, and was a NGO delegate to the United Nations and the Unispace Conference. Alfred is active with nonprofit organizations concerned with peace, the environment, human rights and social injustice, consciousness, and intelligent life in the omniverse, including the Mars Anomaly Research Society. Alfred's investigative journalism has been featured on CBS, CNN, True TV, Press TV, and other mainstream TV networks, and has exposed an international war crimes racketeering organization using exotic technologies such as the HARP aerosol chemtrails weapon system for tectonic and weather warfare, mind control, and other depopulation programs. And for more on this, you can visit www.ecologynews.com. Alfred is currently developing Exo University, an educational entity whose goal is to provide web-based, interactive, continuing education, research, information, and policy regarding exopolitics, sci-sciences, exosciences, to individuals and institutions throughout the world. Again, also an honor to have you back with us, Alfred. Welcome to the broadcast.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I have the honor to be here with three individuals who Randy most recently, who have really affected and are affecting my life deeply. Andy Basiago, Laura Eisenhower, and now Randy, who has come in as the most recent Mars experiencer that I've been able to have personal contact with and interact with. What I've done in this subject matter since being involved in it, and it's rather complex because I wrote the book Exopolitics in 1999 here in Vancouver, Canada, and it was published in the year 2005. Andy Basiago was my editor, and sometime thereafter, either through some sort of time travel technology, we know that a DARPA CIA joint project, Project Pegasus, time traveled it back to 1971, where Andy, in the company of two other witnesses, saw it in person, and it was part of the project. And I can sort of cross-verify that because in 1971, I was general counsel of the New York City EPA. Part of my duties were to speak publicly on the environment. I was asked to speak to a group. On that day, a man in a suit showed up. As very unlike the students and housewives that I generally spoke to. We traveled for about 2 hours. I came to a building. There were about 50 people there. Again, all men in suits or ties, and And I could tell, through my double vision that they weren't normal people. They were government agents of some sort, and they knew something about me, and I was being surveyed. So I kept my cool. I just gave them my usual environmental stump speech, and during my talk, several of the 50, in fact, a relatively large number were gawking at me and trying to knock me off balance. And of course, I knew that there was some sort of intelligence operation going on. Well, it turned out I put it together after 2005 and talking with Andy and his knowledge of Project Pegasus and having seen the book back in 1971, that these were CIA and DoD employees who had been briefed on my book and perhaps what I would be doing at this time, perhaps being on this very broadcast. We don't know what the detail of their time travel surveillance is, and who wanted to see me in real time at that time. So we are now knowing through all of us as a community of delegates, delegated people like Randy is under a specific article of the military code, under the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, coming forward to reestablish constitutional order in the U.S., like Laura, like Andy, like Dr. Dream, who's providing a platform here. From that time forward, in 2005, I began seeking out and interviewing the various Mars explorers and Mars whistleblowers, including others who are not on this program. Brett Stillings, who's been mentioned here, Bernie Mendez, Arthur Neumann, who was a federal laboratory scientist who teleported to Mars for a project, meeting there with various ET societies, and of course Michael Relf, who of all of the project whistleblowers to date, his experiences on Mars seem the most consistent of that version of Mars with Randy Kramer's, and of course with Laura, who has been a great teacher and interpreter of the larger picture, of sort of the cosmic picture of why this is occurring at this time in the larger universe and the larger cosmos. And so in that context, I feel that this is truly an historic meeting at this time, and I'm very grateful that all of this came together, and that perhaps this can be the first step of a movement of open reunion of Mars experiencers. And I believe that it is very important and I know that Andy will be talking in the next section as to his experiences of Mars, but I believe that it is very important to bring together all of these different pictures, because if we sit down and look at it now, one could ask, knowing from what I know about Andy and Brett Stillings and Bernard Mendez and Michael Ralph's and Randy Kramer's experiences, we can ask, well, did they all go to the same planet? And one of the items that comes up is, well, from speaking with Andy, the major focus there, and that, of course, is because the major focus of his experiences were with the various human exophenotypes on Mars, namely, and these are terms that he has developed: Homo martis terris, Homo martis martis, and Homo martis extraterrestrialis. Homo martis terris being sort of our generic cousins, and they are people who are essentially like us. They're the people who were sort of the other half of the common interplanetary society that Earth and Mars had prior to the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, when a fragment of the Vela supernova came into the solar system and made Mars an obloid planet and greatly damaged our own planet and destroyed a great maritime civilization that we had here, and they went underground. And they look very similar to us, and Andy and his father have met them at in New Jersey at a military base, and perhaps Andy can talk about that. Then there's Homo martis martis, which is sort of human-like. They're not the reptoid or the draconian type species that Randy Kramer speaks of, and they're more, if you remember a lot, the German classic film Nosferatu. They actually look like that, and at a nonprofit group that we have called the Mars Anomaly Research Society, ProjectMars.net, there are many photographs and PowerPoints. There's a PowerPoint there that you can see the various photographs from the Mars rovers of these different exophenotypes. And finally, there's the Homo martis extraterrestrialis, which look a little bit like grays. They look like grays, but they're a specific gray, a little bit human-like and a little bit gray-like, that are in and of Mars, and they are an exophenotype that I guess would fall between human and gray, but not be reptoid and not be insectoid, and they are the ones that show up on the rover photographs, Also, if you go to ProjectMars.net, you will see extensive PowerPoints and papers that go into the reptoid and the aggressive reptoid species, intelligent reptoid species that Randy Kramer speaks of. Mm-hmm. And that you can see all of their features, their behavior, and the exophenotypes there. So in terms of applying the law of evidence, documentary evidence, here we have eyewitnesses, Randy Kramer. We have Andrew Basiago, eyewitnesses. And we have the documentary evidence, the photographs from the NASA rovers, which show all exophenotypes being on Mars, namely both the human exophenotypes, Homo marchus terris, Homo marchus marchus, Homo marchus extraterrestrialis, as well as the reptoid, perhaps you could call some of them insectoid. There are also some very far out species there that are apparently of other exophenotypes. I find these very interesting because from a dimensional ecology point of view, all of these characters have souls. And hey, we could have had incarnations as Dracos on Mars, you know, because we just need a little war experience for that side of one incarnation of the four multiple incarnations, simultaneous incarnations that, you know, my particular soul was carrying out at that time. So I don't really, you know, from a cosmic point of view or from an exopolitical point of view, it's important not to be too Earth-human-centric when analyzing the cosmos. Although I recognize from a different point of view, as Earth humans, we're very worried about our turf. And so, that, you know, that's always the participant observer perspective that we have when incarnating in a particular universe, namely this universe in a particular solar system, this one on a particular planet, Earth. And I agree with Laura that this is a special planet. I mean, we have to look that 2,000 years ago, Joshua ben Joseph, according to some theories, was pretty high up soul who incarnated here as an advanced parachutist. We're sort of the after troops coming in to really reclaim this quadrant of the galaxy from a kind of universe rebellion at the soul level from source, because there are multiple levels of drama going on at the purely sort of what I call exopolitical level in terms of the universes of time, space, energy, and matter. That is what we call the multiverse level. And I see that I have about 4 minutes and 47 seconds left. Or no, 3 minutes and 10 seconds left. This is a very complex virtual reality that actually, as an intelligent civilization of souls, together with advanced spiritual beings, together with Source itself, which compositely we all constitute what's called God. We actually create these universes, the huge, humongous number of universes in the multiverse. We create it as vehicles that we can incarnate into for soul development. So all these characters that we're talking about, all these exophenotypes, have souls, and they're all us. Now that's the great paradox. And that's kind of the balance that one must maintain, is scientific and spiritual and emotional and species-centric balance that I think one must maintain, as well as the very humanity of the life and the exercise that we're in, our families, our children, our spouses, our species, our nations. That's what makes this, even though it's a virtual reality, so rich. We really have just scratched the surface in this roundtable discussion, which Laura and Dr. Dream have so graciously brought together. And I just hope, I really hope, and it's our intention, I think our collective intention, that those listening will really begin to tell your friends and your fellows of how rich this entire tapestry is, and begin to pass on the audio archive of this program to others, and really start listening to what's been said here, and start listening to the Mars whistleblowers and to this conversation, and make it part of the daily community conversation. So with that, I want to thank you very much and hand the talking stick back to you, Mark.
Oh, perfect, Alfred. I really have to honor each of you for just bringing your energy to this, for sharing things, for sharing your truth, for bringing your piece of the puzzle together, because each time that it expands, more of it makes sense and has a greater impact on us kind of breaking from all the hidden truths and everything. So to start off this roundtable discussion, Andy, I'd like to have you start off, and you've done a lot of disclosing about Mars and in great detail, and we had to kind of cut you off there and everything, but I'd like you to address what your perspective is on the credibility of Laura's story and of Randy's story, and from your perspective and your experience, what resonates and just kind of where you're at with all of it.
Well, that's a very good question, and I want to make it perfectly clear that not only do I view Laura and Randy as authentic tellers of their accounts and honest people, but I can share specific facts that are deeply embedded there in their accounts that they could not have made up, that correspond to things that happened to me in both Project Pegasus under DARPA in the early 70s, and then under the CIA's Mars Jump Room program of the early 1980s. In other words, I've just been sort of itching to share some facts that sort of cut through to this issue of credibility and veracity and show that they are authentic whistleblowers and that I affirm their testimony. Of course, in the case of Randy, he's operating under the ambit of military law in being empowered to tell about what happened to him, while the rest of us essentially have been civilian whistleblowers. The first fact that I'd like to share is that shortly after meeting Laura in 2011, when I was curious as to whether she had taken the jump room to Mars, she stated they told me they were calling the conveyance that would take me to Mars an ARC. And then in further interaction with Benny Mendez and Brett Stillings, I recalled the fact that in our training with Major Ed Dames in the summer of 1980, he gave us the technical term for the jump rooms, and it was ARC, and it was an anagram standing for Aeronautical Repositioning Chamber, which is precisely what the space elevator or jump room to Mars was doing. And ARC might have been a double entendre in the sense that one of the reasons the jump room was developed is so that personnel from the U.S. could rapidly go through it to Mars in the event of a planetary catastrophe on Earth, and thereby do their part to save U.S. personnel and the human genome. So ARC may have been a covert reference to the original Ark of Noah in that sense. But that's so highly technical that I think it has high meaning and high value in terms of corroborating Laura's account. The second thing I'd like to add is that she's the great-granddaughter of President David Eisenhower, whose vice president was Richard Milhouse Nixon. Not only were all of the personnel that I interacted with as a child on Project Pegasus Nixon Republicans, from my father to Donald Rumsfeld, but so were the personnel that I interacted with during the CIA's Mars Jump Room days of the early 80s, except I would say that Barry Obama and I were clearly much further to the left and registered Democrats. But I'm just trying to distinguish the point here that the use of quantum access to access past and future times and places on Earth, and also a form of time travel to reach Mars, was a Nixon project. and I have something else to show. I don't know if it's surfaced yet. According to Bernard Mendez, even while at his private residence in San Clemente, after leaving the White House, that is resigning on August 9th of 1974, Richard Nixon was serving as an intelligence analyst to the CIA on the Mars jump room program. That is to say that while he was still alive, Nixon was a consulting intelligence analyst, and our CVs would have gone across his desk. So there's the Nixon connection again. Nixon was literally participating in the Mars jump room program for the CIA. Another deeply embedded fact that relates to Laura, her family background, her immediate story, and the involvement of a family member in the Mars jump room program is that we know they were working through families, and they were probably doing so because they wanted to situate a group of American citizens on Mars in the colonies, just as Laura was invited to do. And the family members that we know were involved are indicated right by the immediate group of cadre of whistleblowers who have thus far come forward. I was being trained with my father, and he did one trip, the last trip that I did, which was the May 84 jump, which many of the personnel were on. Brett was on that, Courtney Hunt was on that, and so forth. So then also we have the involvement of the family members Thomas J. Stillings and his son William Brett Stillings. Now in the case of Laura, her family connection does not just rest in broad terms as being the descendant of a beloved American president. In fact, her aunt, Mary Jean Eisenhower, was one of the jumpers, and Bernard Mendez and I can affirm that in the roughly March 1983 time frame, we did a night run with both of us together, with Regina Dugan, and a woman that we met, and when she introduced herself as Mary Jean Eisenhower, I asked her whether she was a descendant of Ike, and she stated, the one and only. Okay, so here we have a connection with the Eisenhower family contributing one of the jumpers, but then also one of the colonists to be approached to settle on Mars. And that's, of course, probably why they were selecting family members or assembling team members who were related. And then the other thing that can't be unwritten, that's deeply embedded, and that shows clearly that Laura is telling the truth, is that, and that her claims correspond with mine, is something that Alfred mentioned, which is that when I was still on Pegasus, as a boy, a year before Laura was born in 1973, she was described in a conversation that took place in front of me as a future political ally of mine. And isn't it curious that of all the 7 billion people in the world, Laura and I are now friends and fellow whistleblowers around the same set of facts? Well, I mean, that's after 30 years, after 40 years since I first heard her name a year before she was born. I mean, that's difficult to unravel. It's so deeply embedded that it literally corroborates her account. Now, Randy went to Mars, and he's made a number of statements. Initially, I was doubtful, but then I've really worked on the non-corresponding information, and I think I can explain it. So let me start with the information that corresponds. In other words, I know I went, so I can now give my testimony that I am absolutely certain that Randy Kramer is authentic and veracious, and he's telling the truth about his experiences on Mars. The first is this. When we were being trained, Dames stated that there were 3 major reasons we were going to be sent to Mars. The first was to establish an extraterrestrial defense regime on the planet Mars, not necessarily against hostile ETs, but simply to protect planet Earth from all threats that could come from outer space. The second was to acquire U.S. territorial sovereignty over Mars by settling individuals there and by sending them there on trips. Well, guess what? Randy was sent there as a permanent settler. He spent 17 years there. And I was sent episodically or periodically about 40 times between 81 and 84. And that our role was described as to acclimate the Martian humanoids and animals to our presence. Well, why would that be necessary? That would be necessary to establish the defense regime. Who is Randy? He's a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps. And it wasn't going to be just some civilian outpost. It was obviously a military operation. And so Randy is literally the embodiment of the military personnel that they described they would be sending after we played our civilian role. of going there for immediate practical reasons sounding under public international law, and sort of organic anthropological reasons of letting or of sort of acclimating the Martian humanoids especially, and also the animals, to our presence. Okay, so that's the first thing I find very striking. Then I examine Randy's personal characteristics, and I compare them to the individuals I knew who were the jumpers. He shares the two prominent traits of high intelligence and a consummate memory. For example, Randy has literally cited that aspect of marine law and policy, chapter and verse, by which he has now been empowered by the Marine Corps to talk about his experiences publicly. And I can certainly say that all of the jumpers were that bright, and they also had consummate memories. Look at Brett even quoting things that Ed Dames said in his lectures to us 30 years later. Randy is clearly an extremely intelligent man. For example, during his presentation of his experiences that we started out with, he used the terms psionically, covertly, seditious, and treasonous, which I would dare say, certainly in today's time, is a graduate level of diction. I think it even goes beyond the current undergraduate mastery of English. So he's a brilliant, articulate man, and that was and clearly has a superb memory. And those were three of the human characteristics they were looking for, because they were sending us to another planet, and they wanted us to be able to experience, remember, and articulate what happened to us with as much higher level specificity as possible. When we, for example, would be debriefed by Major Dames at the Mars Jump Room facility in El Segundo, California, he would say, well, what did you see next? What did you see next? And he would thoroughly debrief us about everything that happened, and we were expected to remember everything that happened accurately and articulate it clearly. Another point of correspondence, which is completely random, but again, you see this in the law. When somebody cites a hard fact and it corresponds to another abstruse or abstruse or obtuse or inscrutable fact that another witness is testifying to, that is taken as a touchstone of credibility, because if you have a random selection of the data, small facts should never really correspond. Was the bank robber wearing a purple sweater or a blue sweater? Okay. In his previous public statements, not today, but in previous comments, Randy has stated that the facilities that he lived in on Mars were small. They could have been sprawling campuses. They could have been a fully fledged military base or something, because we've had the jump room technology to put materiel onto Mars for 30 years, 34 years at least, probably almost 40, if we start with Michael Relf's account. So Randy and I agree that the facilities that we visited, in the case of Randy that he stayed at for many years, were small facilities. And as a trial lawyer, that kind of piques my attention, because there's no reason why that testimony should agree. I mean, Randy states that he went up there as a 17-year-old and was born in 1970, which means that, if I'm correct, Randy, you went up there in 1987 the first time?
That's correct.
Okay.
I want to say the date would have been November 18th, 1987.
Well, there's your superb memory kicking in again. Okay, so Randy first went in 1987, which is 6 years after the Mars Jump Room whistleblowers, jumpers who've come forward, first went in summer of 81. And so here he is, he's going 6 years later, but he's still talking about small facilities. They could have been medium-sized facilities, as I said, sprawling military bases, whatever, but that corresponds factually with a degree of specificity that I find meaningful. Other things that are consistent is that we were shown in our training what the different forms of about 30 large Martian land-based animals were. Randy gave us more information about their anatomy. And in those 7 years, between when we were trained by Dames in 1980 and Randy first going up there 7 years later in 87 and then spending 17 years there, you would expect that permanent personnel on Mars would learn more about the anatomy of the life forms there. So I actually see the difference of opinion between Randy and I about some of the dominant life forms as corroborating, in the sense that he described, for example, that one of them has 2 hearts. I would hope in 7 years of sending personnel there that our government, working with brilliant people like Randy, and Regina Dugan, who entered Caltech at age 16, and a young man who grew up in Hawaii, being raised by a single mom, who would go on to Harvard Law School and Columbia University, who became president. People of that intellectual caliber would have learned something about the life forms. And in fact, Randy corroborates that they found that one of the life forms has two hearts. I also find something, again, this is one of those factually specific things that cannot be faked. I stated the ages of the jumpers that I knew of for a reason, describing Brett as starting at age, well, when we were going to Mars, he was 14. Regina was 17, I was 18, William McCool was 18, and Barack Obama was 19. Now, if you take the median ages, it's very close to 17. And that's the age that his experiences began, that Randy stated, at least the actual experience of going to Mars. Here you have literally a correspondence between the two groups of experiencers, where both independently state that they first went at age 17. That is complete corroboration of who they were working with. And as testimony, it's weak in the sense that it requires the listener to assume that we were sent at very young ages. I'm often asked, why did they time travel you starting when you were age 6? Why did you all go when you were in your late teens? Why didn't they use astronauts? I mean, wasn't Neil Armstrong 39 when he first set foot on the moon? Well, that's our testimony, and it's difficult testimony. It goes against common logic or common sense, and it corresponds between Randy and the previous whistleblowers, at least, and their colleagues in the jump room program. So I find that a major correspondence that I think is factually significant and affirms Randy's account. Other things that are, also the mode of transport. I stated that it was a teleportation technology called a jump room. Randy has, and as affirmed by Brett and Bernie, and Randy has stated that it was a space plane with teleportation capability. Well, again, we're not agreeing with each other, but we're agreeing that teleportation was used. Now, why would they have, is there an internal logic here to these modes of transport that we've cited, respectively? Yes, there is. We were sent as a group of civilians to achieve those three functions of establishing a defense regime, creating a basis to claim Mars as U.S. territory under public international law, and to acclimate Martian humanoids and animals to our presence. That was not Randy's role. He was a military officer being sent there. And so it makes sense that because military personnel would have to be more mobile on the surface, that we would have been sent basically in a safer way, the jump rooms, so we would be intact when we arrived on Mars. But Randy and his military cadre would need a form of teleportation where they could move in a rapid response way around the surface. So we're both citing teleportation, but Randy's adding the military context of how he got there, which I think is corroborative of the veracity of his claims, the accuracy. A couple things that are more difficult to interpret. One is that the life forms that I encountered were the three, at different times in my life, once on Earth and then twice on Mars, were the humanoids that Alfred described, and the reptoids that I encountered were reptile or dinosaur-like, where I think Randy's talking about more exotic animal life, where you're dealing with either humanoid reptiles or insectivoid mammals. And so an explanation for that is present in the account of both of us, and also with Brett and Bernie's affirmation, which is that clearly we were visiting the middle latitudes, and Randy stated in his testimony here today that he was clearly in a northern latitude. He was in a polar location, which is, well, I shouldn't say northern. It was a polar location, either in the northern or southern reaches of Mars, where we know there is snow, which he testified to. So the fact that it was always about 70 degrees when I got there, and that Randy was talking about the cold that he was courageously dealing with for those 17 years, that is attributable to latitude. And we don't know why they were putting a U.S. presence there. It may literally have been to protect the primarily medium latitude humanoid civilization from the more aggressive, exotic creatures that were in the northern latitudes. And I might add that the striding gremlin that I found in January of 2010, in that famous photograph of the so-called Martian trees, it is a reptoid or frog-like looking bipedal creature with about a 6-foot-tall human in its clutches. That could indicate predation. We know that was a northern or polar area of Mars because we know where that photograph was taken. It was taken very close to the North Pole of Mars. And so that corresponds, that anomaly finding made by myself on behalf of the Mars Anomaly Research Society corresponds to Randy's claims that he encountered reptoids and exotic insectivoid mammal-type creatures in his location in a polar region of Mars, in several mutually or simultaneously corresponding ways. So I think the striding gremlin photograph corroborates at least 3 major factual elements of the account of Randy Kramer. Another sticking point for me initially, and why I was skeptical and I should have been less prejudiced, so I apologize, Randy, is temperature. But then again, we were in different locations on the planet. The other one, which was strongest in my mind in disbelieving you, and I now see no problem with it, is the color of the sky. As I testified before, images of it were found by Mars anomalists like Paul Goodwin and of the United Kingdom and Andrew R. Steck of the United States. I had already stated publicly, I believe I stated to Alfred in our first public appearance about the Mars cover-up at James Gilliland's sanctuary, his annual summer conference in Trout Lake, Washington. I stated that the Martian sky was blue and that was one of the things that was later going to be corroborated by anomalists. Well, I had a sticking point in the sense that Randy had given testimony that the sky was red, but it was at his location. And it was at a location where there could be dust, red dust kicked up in the atmosphere, and there was clearly snow. And if you look at the mountain scene from that polar location, in which we found the putative trees, and then I identified the striding gremlin, which is basically my favorite discovery because it's such an exotic creature. It's so neat, as an animal. At that location, it's much more likely that the sky would be red because of snow, and the hillsides there are kind of a chartreuse, kind of a dark red, which I think Randy described in his interview to Dr. Michael Salla. So I would just like to say, to make a long story short, one other element. Randy has stated a rank as captain in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I clearly can tell by his high intelligence and his great articulateness that he's clearly the caliber of individual that the branches of the military service have always assigned military rank to, namely accelerated into the officer corps, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. But also, the rank of captain is the same status within the Marine Corps that the rank of lieutenant commander is in the Navy. And 2 individuals who have served the U.S. intelligence community military in need-to-know capacities, namely the CIA officer Courtney Maurice Hunt and somebody who was once the top civilian scientist for the Navy, Dr. Eldon Andrew Bird, both told me that they had verified that as a result of my service in Project Pegasus and then the Mars Project, I'm covertly or shadow listed in U.S. Navy records as a lieutenant commander, and I was accelerated to that position when I earned my Juris Doctor degree, which is a doctoral degree. I've never verified that, but I have testimony from 2 sources that is the case, and that is the corresponding rank in the Navy. Randy had no way of knowing that because I had never stated that publicly because I was concerned that I would be identified as a whistleblower who was playing some covert role for the Navy, but I'm not. I'm an independent whistleblower, and I'm not doing any functions for the Navy, and besides these 2 programs, I never have. But I did have my picture taken as a Navy officer in fall of '81. So just to sum this all up, even the things like the time frame, how Randy started 3 years after we had ended creating a context for military presence there. The bottom line is that I am utterly convinced of the veracity of these 2 individuals and the truth of their account, and the fact that something very important is happening right now in the truth movement, which is that individuals with fundamentally important information about the U.S. presence on Mars and the fact that it is an inhabited planet and all of the implications and complications that obtain is now happening in real time. We have entered the era of truth. And it's an honor to serve with both of you in that important cause in human civilization.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate that. It has meant a lot to me to hear that, and I've always had questions about which things make sense to me or that I experienced that other people may or may not have experienced. And I feel that I've tried to get good information on, geographical locations that would account for different ecosystems and different biological habitats and so forth. So I appreciate all of that. Thank you very much. And I just want to specify, I'm pretty sure when I did my interview with Michael Sala that I tried to make it clear that the sky could be a lot of different colors, from blue to red to purple. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely have a very clear memory of the mountainside that we pretty much lived in, on a very regular basis, having a very, very bright, clear blue sky on a regular basis. But very interesting times, sunrise, sunsets, where you could get this really, really lavender purple sky, which is quite amazing.
Right, and this goes to the principle in the law that absence of evidence does not connote evidence of absence, because I only went to the warm equatorial region of Mars. Your experience includes either both or being at more polar latitudes where there was snow and so forth. And so you did clarify essentially the color schema from the equator up to the poles, the north and south pole of Mars, quite credibly, because there's different atmospheric factors that would attribute the purple. The fact that I didn't encounter the purple doesn't mean that your account of encountering purple skies is not true.
Oh, right.
It could very well be attributable to what seems present in the facts, which is that you were in a different region of the planet.
Yeah, for certain. And I would get the impression that some of the larger, predatory reptiles that would have been more active in a warmer southern region would not necessarily have liked being on the surface in the cold, because pretty much everybody up in that region was living underground where it was warmer, near, sort of geothermal activity or something.
Yeah, and also there's also something that we can speculate about. I don't really find evidence of it when I compare our accounts,
right?
But I think it's entirely possible that the animals that you report, the two major animals that you testified to in your interview with Dr. Sala, and to some extent here today, Alfred referenced it, the sort of bipedal reptoid humanoid and the insectivoid, apparently mammalian type, possibly bipedal creature as well, that those might have been the life forms that we were being put in the equatorial region to help protect the humanoids I've described, namely our genetic cousins on Mars, Homo martis terris, the classic Martian humanoid with the elongated head and sometimes antennae in the forehead and pointy ears and long fingers, the Homo martis martis, and then even possibly the Homo martis extraterrestrialis, which are like the great ETs, that we may have been there in the equatorial region and unopposed by those three types of humanoids, because up in the more polar regions, there were two species of advanced intelligent predators. We were dealing with predators that were basically stupid dinosaurs.
Right.
But you're describing two species of bipedal, advanced intelligent predators that seemed very, very threatening and a high risk to you and your colleagues. And we were at risk of predation by the dinosaur-like reptoids, but they were a pretty animal-like intelligence. And so
yeah, they're very,
very
very intelligent for certain. I mean, certainly our first interactions with them, we engaged in a little bit of prejudice of not thinking they were intelligent, but believe me, over time it became very, very, very clear that they were equal or in some cases, superior intelligence to our average or above average.
So in that way, I think your testimony corroborates that of Brett and Bernie and I, in the sense that gives the raison d'etre for why the indigenous humanoid civilization in the warm regions, which was presumably equatorial, didn't ever oppose our presence. We were never confronted. Courtney Hunt and I were even met at the front of one of the jump rooms by one of the indigenous Martians, the Homo martis martis, and walked about a mile with him taking huge strides. And he took us down into one small area of their underground civilization. And that also, by the way, is corroborative of not only what I experienced on Mars, being taken down into that primarily underground civilization by that being, but by the testimony of CIA officer Virginia Olds, who contacted me 4 days after I published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, in 2008-2009 timeframe. And she testified that my paper was accurate and that I needed to know that there were about 1 million humanoids living in a primarily underground civilization there, because she didn't have the information about me going there. She was just affirming the humanoids that I had placed in the paper, and that there were about 1 million and that they lived underground. So you didn't know that testimony. Alfred and I did, so Alfred can corroborate my claim that Virginia Olds gave that testimony in 2008 and 9, and now in your testimony you're affirming the concept, the fact that there's an extensive underground civilization there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm just honored.
The surface is hostile enough seasonally that there's really no way that you could have an above-ground colony or civilization that wasn't heavily shielded or protected. And I wouldn't even recommend that from, just the seasonal storms that can get, 100 miles an hour plus.
Right, especially with the loss of their ionosphere during the solar system catastrophe of 11,500 BCE, lightly complected humanoids would have to seek shelter from the sun to not develop skin cancer and other maladies. So,
we had a very protective environment suit, very, covering every inch of you, and a pretty solid helmet with a pretty good cover. It was very protective. You were sealed in and covered tight for sure.
And the humanoids that I showed over in the rock garden north of Tsiolkovsky Ridge in NASA JPA image PIA 10214 are wearing something in the nature of a royal blue neoprene wetsuit-like garment.
That's the light armor. Wow. Okay, that's a confirmation I've never shared with anybody, is what the light armor looks like. And the light armor looks more like a bluish neoprene, tighter, kind of like a thick wetsuit, but not. Yeah, that's the light body armor, not the heavy powered.
Right, they're a little lighter than royal blue.
Yeah.
Very pretty shade of blue. And also, we didn't need to do that. We weren't even screened for contamination by bacteria and virus when we returned to El Segundo, because we were told we were there for such short periods of time that if we got a little extra solar radiation, it wasn't going to give us skin cancer.
Right.
So we were wearing street clothes. I did about 30 trips to the telecommunications post, which was about a mile from the jump room that we would call the corkscrew, and I was just in my clothing from college. In fact, one of my classmates asked me about the red dust on my boots when I went back to UCLA and walked to class. And so I was literally taking the dust of Mars to Chatsworth, to Westwood, when I was living my ordinary life after returning through the El Segundo jump room. And we were just dressed in street clothes.
Wow. Yeah, well, when I first got there and we got off the lander that brought us there, we were basically, I'm sure we were at a lower, more mid-region, like maybe what you're talking about, where Ares Primus was, because we stepped out into the open air and it was a cool breeze, but I could feel warm sun hitting me, and we were just wearing, like these coverall jumpsuits with really nothing else on, and we're, walked across the tarmac from there to a smaller shuttle that took us to our more permanent locations. But when we first got there, it was just, step on out into the air and just coveralls.
Right. Now, another thing, just to close out, one thing that is sort of a corollary to one of the findings where I find correlation is that lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy and the captain rank in the Army and Marine Corps are the first qualifying intelligence ranks. That is to literally have top secret intelligence communicated, remembered, to take executive action to protect it, to even take human life to protect highly classified information. And Randy and I both state that rank. Civilians would not know that. I mean, I'm obviously a civilian in the sense now that I'm no longer employed on these projects. But within the culture of intelligence, that is a known fact. And so I would just like to share that on this broadcast, that these programs are so highly classified that anybody claiming participation and knowledge of project details would have to have reached that rank. Of course, Brett mentions that when we did our first jump, we were informed that we had reached the lieutenant rank in the U.S. Navy, and so the individuals who even were serving basically in a quasi-military capacity, if not a civilian capacity, we still were shadow listed as military officers, and those are the first qualifying intelligence ranks, and that's another similarity that my account and Randy's have that I think is corroborating.
This is really excellent. I can't even tell you, having spoken to both of you separately and heard the stories and everything, this interaction between the two of you is really, really fascinating. Let's bring Laura and Alfred in and take this last 20 minutes or so and just allow sort of a free flow of thoughts and interaction between the four of you about this and different things that have come up while each of you were speaking.
Sure. What came up for me, the first question, which I'd like to ask both Randy and Andy, is this: why do you think there is such secrecy about Earth's visits to Mars among Earth society? Why keep this secret? I don't get it.
I'd be happy to answer that question. From my intelligence briefings that I get on a weekly basis now from my Brigadier General, we've had conversations about that. And the agenda has been, the agenda started as a preservation program in which we wanted to preserve the DNA and the culture and so forth of human society. Over time, that became co-opted to a program. Hey, why don't we just keep what we like and get rid of everybody else? And so over time, the secrecy has been maintained because the program has changed from one of, hey, let's just save everything, to, no, let's save a few people and then get rid of everybody else we don't want. So the reason for maintaining secrecy over time was not because it was supposed to be that way, but because the agenda has shifted to one of, let's save the very special people that we want to keep at the Mars colony and on the lunar colony and the lunar base, and then maybe just get rid of everybody else on Earth, what we call the surface dwellers.
Alfred, I would add that my theory, obviously I was involved in the program earlier than Randy, so my statement can, I think, be considered less authoritative, because I agree that it should not have been kept secret, but I think it was an intelligence, a form of an intelligence finding, that because the success of the project involved zero infinity risk, namely it would be successfully implemented or it would be a catastrophe, that they decided to keep it secret because they would be doing things like maintaining a military operation and presence on another planet, and they wanted to make sure that happened. I mean, in the same way they wanted to ultimately acquire Mars, namely conquer it under public international law by sending settlers and regular visitors there, I think they wanted to make sure that the defense regime was implemented, because it may have implicated, if Earth is destroyed, it may implicate literally the survival of the human genome. And that was of such singular significance to the human race that they wanted to make sure that they didn't involve the democratic processes and public and institutions of our civilization in the process of maintaining the presence there. For example, if it was $1 trillion expenditure, they would have had to do things like have Donald Rumsfeld announce that $2.3 trillion were missing from the defense budget on 9/10 of 2001, and then the next day launch the false flag of 9/11. So, when you're dealing with $1 trillion project with a small group of civilian and military personnel, but one that nonetheless is related to the survival of the human race in the cosmos, I think recognizing that fact, they decided to not hazard the civilian factors, which could have included things like defunding the program.
Well,
absolutely. I think that's absolutely correct, and I'm certain that the original thinking around that was absolutely correct. I'm just interjecting that over time it became more of we're a big bunch of fat cats, and why don't we just keep this for ourselves and screw everybody else? So I think initially the intentions were sound and scientific and logical and good, and it's just become kind of psychologically perverted for a number of reasons.
Okay, well, here's my question then. So we're dealing with, different timelines, and some of these potential catastrophes that they might have wanted to save the human genome in regards to seem to be based on HAARP or artificial events that were basically put in motion through, these technologies. So how can we tell, what's real and what isn't, and what are we going to do here now that we've got FEMA camps breathing down our neck and Ebola viruses, and now that you're able to disclose, Randy, and this is for you too, Andrew, where do you see us going with these threats, and where does that relate to timelines and the timelines that they want to see? Because it seems like there's a few. One would be, the simulated catastrophes. Another one might be something more natural, and then the ones that they're engineering, Ebola and then FEMA camps. I mean, just help us to sort all this out if you could.
Sure,
even though that's a complicated question, but just how to get a grip on where we are right now and what these timelines are and who's in charge here.
Right. No, I'm happy to do that because this is certainly a subject of regular intelligence conversations that I'm having with the Brigadier General, so this is right up the alley of things that we've been talking about. So you have essentially, if you want to look at the tiny number of people who are in power around the world who occupy positions of authority and power, it's a tiny percentage of people. However you want to look at them and see them, that coalition of personnel is divided up into a number of factions, little sub-factions, who essentially make up 2 or 3 larger maxi factions at the moment. And the problem with what's happening with the maxi factions is you have a side in which says, in order to create our perfect new civilization using all this wonderful technology and everything we have, first thing we have to do is clean out this crappy old civilization by burning it, flushing it, whatever, to get rid of the things that we don't want in order to rebuild this much better civilization that we think, that we have the technology for. But essentially they don't want to spend the money and the time to make that transition from where we are to that. They would rather just get rid of what they don't like and then implement something. The opposing maxi factions to that are saying either A or B, which is, we really think that that's a serious negative impact that we're not going to easily psychologically or emotionally recover from it as a people or as a species, having that large of an eye-off or a pull-off on the entire planet in order to rebuild without, going the next century trying to recover from, collective post-traumatic stress disorder that would set us back, maybe a bit. Versus this other sort of maxi faction that said, no, bad idea. The second that we destabilize ourselves and weaken our infrastructure and weaken the population and weaken our ability to defend ourselves is the second that any of these actual threatening invasion plans that may be on somebody's books who are, waiting in the wings for us to look moment and to look like we've got a wounded leg and then come in for the kill. So a number of intelligence reports, the intelligence officers of the United States Marine Corps Special Section and some other intelligence agencies around the world are certainly seeing this action of driving it into the ground in order to rebuild it as a negative setup in which will lead us to a situation in which we will be made vulnerable and could be attacked. So given that scenario, here's what I think is about to happen or is happening. That's all fighting itself out. Those people are completely fighting and attacking and destroying each other in a huge way that we see some aspects of it manifesting itself in sort of the non-covert world, but we also don't see a lot of it. But we're going to see more and more and more and more of it. So I will say that in one way it's going to get worse before it gets better, but on the other hand, that some of what we're seeing is the manifestation of some very, very negative people in control for a very, very long time are losing their grip. And I think we can predict that they are about to lose their grip that is giving them that kind of unchecked control. And that control is going to be checked really, really soon, which is going to put everything in question, which will give us the opportunity for, again, that coalitions of those micro and maxi factions of the people who try and run the world to renegotiate a whole new plan and agenda for the planet that could look way better than the alternative 3 Agenda 21 that's on the table now, and would give us an opportunity to, instead of cleaning out 6 or 7 billion people, actually shoring up civilization and creating a floor for the entire planet, and then implementing a futuristic technological economy market plan that actually transitions us from this old 18th century, 19th century coal burning fossil fuel burning wage slave system into something that's actually a 21st century model, which one last thing I want to interject in that statement is I think one of the main reasons that they have been fighting disclosure of all these extraterrestrial species that could be talking to us is because if we started talking to our neighbors, we would find that very few of them have these exploitative, consumption, market-based models, and we would realize that that's not a really good way of doing things, and we would have other models to start looking at on how we can actually easily transition ourselves by looking at other models that have done that. One of the reasons we sit there and go, what do we do, is because we're not looking at other models of success. And the second that we get to talk to our intergalactic brothers and sisters and our neighbors, they will be happy to sit down and show us their models of success that they've worked over the last number of hundreds or thousands of years for themselves.
Right.
So that's where I think we are, and that's where I think we're headed.
Yeah. That is very interesting. What occurs to me with regard to Mars is that there are, very credible reports that the Martians had a regular Earth education program going in the first part of the 20th century, whereby they would regularly have delegations of leading Earth opinion makers taken on 2-week jaunts of Mars. They would pick them up either in Brazil, I think was one of the main launch points, and they would be taken probably to the Homo Martis Terris, that is to the advanced human civilization on Mars. I think that the Vatican was one of the main arrangers of this, and it was out of the Vatican actually that the chronovisor technology came, and so we have this track here where there was a lot of quote an enlightened intercultural exchange program going on that even preceded any of the U.S. military programs. And so I'm just wondering whether or not the U.S. elites were influenced by Illuminati factions who are influenced by negative interdimensional and ET factions to sort of push aside these positive cultural communication factions with Mars and get more into a martial presence on Mars, which then led into the alternative three. I.e., the alternative three didn't come out of nowhere. There was always, and even if you go back to Tesla and the interactive program that he started in 1901 with the flash from Mars and then with his thing back and forth, there was a period of enlightened cultural communication between Earth and Mars at that time, which then the Martians grew into cultural visits with leading, Earth humans, smart people of a positive nature, which I think then was taken over by the negative elites, which led to the U.S. kind of invasion or military type. Could you comment on that, both of you?
I think that could very well describe the development of this current situation. The only thing I would add is, in terms of the eras involved and the fact that not just around the turn of the last century when Tesla was communicating with the Martians, but even as recently as 1970 when my father and I had contact with 3 Martian astronauts at a hangar in New Jersey, an air hangar in New Jersey, and they were clearly on a technical liaison mission in which they were assisting the United States government to develop conventional spacecraft or aircraft as advanced as theirs, namely what in all likelihood became Project Aurora. that they were basically humane, cooperative individuals who were briefing our aerospace community. So I guess that we could ultimately be in a common defense regime with them. So some element of this involves protecting both planets, probably, and that also explains why the Martian humanoids posed no opposition to us when we were roaming around their planet. So I think an element in this may be a multi-generational plan for Earthians and Martians to collaborate to protect the civilizations of both planets from an off-planet threat, or also to assist the Martian population in circumstances that are much more difficult to cope with because of the biological limits of Mars versus Earth. That we may have made a deal where, for example, they gave us the jump rooms and the Martian space planes, namely the Aurora, in exchange for us sending civilian and military personnel there to protect the sort of equatorial, benign human or benevolent humanoid civilization from bipedal humanoids living elsewhere on the planet that represented a pretty serious threat to individual Martians and perhaps to their civilization. And then you have the factor of potentially off-planet threats. There's also the fact that there would have been an interest on the part of both, as we can see in Graham Hancock's book, The Mars Mystery, to protect both Earth and Mars from a return of the catastrophe where they were struck by debris from space. Graham Hancock makes the argument that debris field may have been circling and it may come back to hit both planets again in the nature of a meteor shower, cycling back across the skies of a given planet. So there may be sound cooperative reasons why there would have been this multi-generational covert program. Of course, our friend Jay Widener claims that the Bavarian Illuminati, or that is to say, his definition of the Bavarian Illuminati would be the York Rite of Freemasonry that was started by Adam Weishaupt beginning in 1776, was for the purpose of creating the United States of America so that ultimately it could arrange the return of human beings to Mars, and that being an explanation of why the dollar bill has the Great Pyramid on it, because the Great Pyramid was sort of the mark or shrine on Earth where the Earth linkage of the last civilization was symbolized. So I don't know if the conspiracy goes that far back. Certainly maybe socially and politically it does. But I think the immediate conspiracy could have been launched entirely for beneficial reasons. Maybe Ed Dames was telling us the truth when he gave us the three major reasons. In response to something that Lauren said, I'd like to say that, in fact, we don't know whether we were told the truth. Maybe the whole reason for getting personnel up there was because there are certain strategic minerals on Mars that they needed to launch Star Wars, to implement the Star Wars defense regime or something more Earth-based. But I think that it's a good thing that Earthians and Martians have been in communication and that we've been there. But at the same time, I also agree with Randy's observation that it was clearly a program that was corrupted. So I think we're clearly having a hygienic effect in talking about it. You know, Justice Justice Louis D. Brandeis stated that sunshine is the ultimate antiseptic. And so I would add that truth is the ultimate antidote to unconstitutionality. So just to close out by saying, in response to Laura's major question, I think the major response should be a truth presidency that would establish processes of truth-telling around the ET cover-up, the time travel cover-up, the Mars cover-up, and all of the genocidal-related programs like FEMA, chemtrails, HAARP, and Ebola in open congressional testimony under a truth president and vice president, possibly to include Andrew D. Basiago and Laura M. Eisenhower. That would be my main response. We need a truth presidency. It's not true that the president is at some low position in the intelligence community. The president has to be consulted and has to agree on the launching of all of these covert intelligence and military programs. They're under his constitutional responsibility. We are clearly dealing with the advent of unconstitutional forms of government, and I think that the major antidote has to be a truth presidency.
All right.
Well,
I just want to step in here, just looking at the time, and that was perfect, Andrew, because I'm going to ask each person to do their closing remark, and so we've got you covered. Randy, let's go to you, and then Laura, and then to Alfred, and let's just tie up your, we've got about a minute and a half each, so just a few sentences that ties up your energy around all this and the value of this and perhaps even what's next.
Certainly, I'll be happy to. I think I have a pretty specific message that I can end here with. United States Marine Corps Special Section Special Code Article 21 stipulates that Special Section officers, under the conditions under which either a 50% reduction in productivity, 50% reduction in invasive or compromised leadership, which would mean that if more than 49% of what we can identify as the governmental structure were to be compromised, and or a situation under which 75% or greater hampering of efficiency of that operational governmental device has been reduced by a percentage of 75% or more, allows special section officers to disregard other agreements, other secrecy oaths, other contracts, other treaties in order to restore legislative and executive constitutionality and legal authority over programs which have gone rogue and out of authority, which are clearly what's responsible for every ill that we can think of is really caused by some secret organization doing something that they have twisted and warped into something that's very negative. I will absolutely agree that many of these things were started with the best of intentions, and a lot of fear and paranoia was infused because of what was happening during and after World War II, and it got everyone very scared and frightened of a global military dominating force of any kind, and made everyone think that they had to be defensive about that. But we are at a state now where we have gotten so far from the legal, executive, constitutional, legislative authority that I want to make it very clear to every single politically elected person to office, every legislative person in the executive branch, every single military officer who is within the sound of my voice needs to understand that irregardless of any other orders which they have been given, those orders are illegal and do not apply when restoration of legal, constitutional, legislative, and executive authority is the priority in the umbrella of law. If I'm to understand this, and I'm not a lawyer, in the umbrella of law, those articles of the Constitution are greater than everything else. And so everyone needs to understand that whatever papers you sign, whatever anybody has told you you must do or you must not do, you need to understand that is not true. You have one obligation that you have sworn your oaths to, and one obligation only, and that is to protect the people, country, planet, and the people, Constitution of, I'm flustered, the people, country, Constitution of the United States of America from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so any domestic enemy which has reduced legality to rogue illegality and criminality is criminal and is not within the law and does not have legal authority. And I want to remind every person of that none of those persons who are exerting illegal control, they do not have legal authority whatsoever. Persons who are acting within the appropriate codes of their the UCMJ and or the specific codes and regulations of their military branch and their oaths, those people are in proper legal authority and have the authority to arrest those other people. I'm done.
Thank you, Randy. And Laura?
Well, I just want to say we all know that we have incredible power, purpose, potential, and promise. We really need to upgrade and recognize what we're truly made of. And so my term, Alternative 4, is really about the power of the human spirit. It's all about the unification of the human race. It's about us being authentic, about us doing the inner work, and about us waking up on the inside as we learn about what's happening on the outside, and that we all step up and take responsibility for our part because we each have that collective purpose.
Excellent. And Alfred?
Yes, I'd like to say that from an historical perspective for which there's good evidence. Earth and Mars were an interplanetary society up until about 11,500 years ago, and we are now in the initial phases of reintegrating Earth and Mars as a reintegrated interplanetary society. And this began with the initiative of the Martians, as far as we can tell, at the turn of the century, when they started to contact our most advanced scientists, namely Tesla, who picked up on it and began his series of communications. The Martians then reached out and started a Visit Mars for 2 weeks on a cultural holiday program. They had tours organized with leading cultural figures from around the world. They would spend 2 weeks on Mars. All of this seems to have been hijacked with the sometime after World War II with the Alternative 3, and so where the Earth forces, the kind of the negative forces now, who want to take it over, and who wanted to hide the initial positive Martian overtures toward Earth to reunite us as a society, and those figures they're going beyond trying to colonize Mars. As Randy indicated, they are trying to depopulate Earth and make Earth kind of an elite theme park, or even blow us up, some kind of odd mind control dream from their negative interdimensional handlers. So this is so sci-fi, irregular that I urge everyone to really wake up to the larger picture. Have U.S. constitutions in hand. Listen to the man Randy. Listen to Andy, to people who have been on Mars. Look at the historical record and move forward. And I want to thank you all. Thank you.
Wow, this has really been incredible. I'd like to just say to Randy Kramer and Andrew Basiago and Laura Eisenhower and Alfred Webre, thank you so much for your dedication and commitment. It's not always easy, and I know that from firsthand seeing it, but you all are making a huge difference, and you're making that difference on behalf of all of us, and I honor you and more respect than I could ever put into words for each of you, and thank you so much for bringing this to Awaken the Dream Radio this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Awake in the Dream Radio with Laura Eisenhower and Dr. Dream.